This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I've been putting off sharing this for months, but I think I'm finally ready to talk about what happened to me at Devil's Sinkhole last summer. I'm still trying to make sense of it all, and there are parts I can barely bring myself to think about, let alone write down. But I need to get this out. It was about 6 months after my divorce was finalized. I was feeling lost and desperate for a change of scenery, so I decided to take a solo RV trip to Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area in Texas. As a geologist, I've always been fascinated by unique geological formations, and I thought the massive limestone sinkhole would be the perfect place to clear my head and maybe find some inspiration. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon and set up my RV in the small campground. There were only a couple other campers there, which suited me just fine. I was looking forward to some solitude. As the sun started to set, I decided to take a quick walk over to the sinkhole viewing area before it got dark. The sinkhole itself was breathtaking, a gaping chasm over 350 feet deep, descending into inky blackness. Standing at the railing, peering down into that vast abyss, I felt a strange mix of awe and unease. There was something almost alive about it. I shook off the feeling and snapped a few photos before heading back to my RV for the night. That's when things started to get weird. As I was reviewing the photos on my camera, the screen suddenly went fuzzy and distorted. I figured it was just some kind of glitch, but when I tried to turn the camera off and on again, it wouldn't respond at all. Frustrated, I set it aside and decided to relax with some music instead. But when I tried to play something on my phone, all I got was harsh static and garbled noise. I was starting to get a little freaked out by the electronics acting up, so I stepped outside for some fresh air. The sun had fully set by then, and the sky was filled with millions of stars. It was a breathtaking sight, but as I gazed upward, I noticed something odd. The stars seemed to be moving, shifting and swirling in strange patterns. I blinked hard and looked again, sure I must be seeing things. But no, the stars were definitely moving, coalescing into eerie shapes that made my skin crawl. Thoroughly unnerved, I hurried back inside and tried to distract myself by reading. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As I sat there in the quiet RV, I became aware of a low, pulsing hum seeming to emanate from the ground itself. It was barely perceptible at first, but grew steadily louder until it filled my head. And then I heard it, a voice whispering my name. "Lisa," it hissed. "Lisa Marcollis." I whipped my head around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come here, Lisa. You've disturbed us. There will be a price to pay." Panic rising in my throat, I scrambled to lock all the doors and windows. But even inside the RV, I didn't feel safe. Shadows seemed to writhe and dance in the corners of my vision. The air felt thick and oppressive, like something unseen was pressing in on me from all sides. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. It felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion overcame terror, and I must have dozed off. I woke with a start sometime in the early hours of the morning. The RV was pitch black and deathly quiet, too quiet. I couldn't even hear the usual nighttime sounds of insects or wind. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with mounting horror that I wasn't alone. There was a figure standing at the foot of my bed, a tall, gaunt silhouette blacker than the surrounding shadows. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure slowly raised one impossibly long arm, pointing a skeletal finger directly at me. And then it spoke, in a voice like grinding stones. "The sinkhole hungers, Lisa Marcolis. It demands sacrifice. You cannot escape its pull." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just a nightmare. When I opened them again, the figure was gone, but a foul, sulphurous stench lingered in the air. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I bolted from the RV. I had to get out of there, had to put as much distance between myself and that cursed place as possible. But as I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, I noticed something on the ground near the RV door, an old leather-bound book that definitely hadn't been there the night before. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The cover was unmarked, the pages yellowed with age. As I flipped through it, my blood ran cold. It was filled with bizarre symbols and diagrams, and what looked like ritual instructions in some ancient language. And there, scrawled in the margin of one page, was my name. That's when I heard the screech of bats. I looked up to see a massive swarm pouring out of the sinkhole, thousands upon thousands of them. But they weren't behaving normally. Instead of dispersing, they were coalescing into a massive, undulating shape in the sky. A shape that looked disturbingly like a giant, leering face. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I threw the book down and ran for my car, not even bothering to grab any of my belongings from the RV. As I peeled out of the campground, I could see dark, mist-like tendrils starting to emerge from the sinkhole in my rearview mirror. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was several states away. I've never gone back for my RV or equipment. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if it was just some kind of stress-induced breakdown. But then I'll catch a whiff of that sulfur smell, or wake up in a cold sweat hearing that grating voice whispering my name. And I know it was real. I still don't understand what happened to me at Devil's Sinkhole. Maybe I never will. But I know I'll never set foot in that place again. Some things are better left undisturbed. Never been more terrified in my life than during my recent trip to Caprock Canyon State Park. As a wildlife photographer, I've been to some pretty remote places, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened there. It all started when I decided to head to Caprock Canyon to try and jumpstart my stagnant career. At 34, I felt like I was running out of time to make a name for myself in the competitive world of wildlife photography. I figured a few weeks camping in the rugged Texas landscape might yield some portfolio-worthy shots. The first couple of days were uneventful. I hiked the trails, scouted locations, and took some decent photos of the local wildlife. But on the third night, things took a turn for the weird. I was reviewing my photos from that day when I noticed something odd in the background of one shot. At first, I thought it was just a smudge on the lens, but when I zoomed in, I could make out what looked like the faint outline of a woman in old-fashioned clothes. I chalked it up to my eyes playing tricks on me and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. As I tried to fall asleep, I kept hearing what sounded like whispers just outside my tent. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The whispers seemed to have a cadence to them, almost like someone was trying to speak to me. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I seriously considered packing up and leaving, but my stubbornness and the thought of going home empty-handed kept me there. I spent the day hiking to a more remote area of the park, hoping a change of scenery would help clear my head. As the sun started to set, I set up my camera to try and get some shots of the landscape in the fading light. That's when things got really freaky. I was looking through the viewfinder when I saw her, a woman in a long dress, standing about 50 yards away. She was translucent, like a projection, and seemed to be staring right at me. I jerked back from the camera, heart pounding. When I looked up, there was nothing there. Hands shaking, I checked the photo I'd just taken. There she was, clear as day. I took another shot quickly, but this time the image was empty. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and practically ran back to my campsite. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way, convinced I was being followed. When I finally made it back to my tent, I zipped myself in and tried to calm down. That's when the noises started. At first it was just subtle creaks and rustles that I could almost convince myself were normal nighttime sounds, but then I heard distinct footsteps circling my tent. Something, or someone, was out there watching me. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent flap. I could see a shadow looming there, backlit by the moonlight. My whole body was trembling as I waited for whatever was going to happen next. Suddenly, there was a deafening bang on the side of the tent, like someone had slammed their fist into it. I let out an embarrassingly high-pitched scream and scrambled backward. The banging continued, moving around the tent in a frenzy. I fumbled for my flashlight and phone, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip them. When I finally got the flashlight on and shone it around, the banging stopped abruptly. The shadow outside was gone. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my sleeping bag, flashlight clutched to my chest. Every little sound made me flinch. I kept thinking I could hear that whispering again, but it was so faint I couldn't be sure. As soon as the sun came up, I burst out of the tent, half expecting to see it surrounded by footprints, but there was nothing. No signs at all that anything had been there during the night. I knew I should leave. Everything in me was screaming to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of capturing something incredible. If I could just get solid proof of whatever was going on, it could be the breakthrough I'd been waiting for. So I stayed. God help me, I stayed. I spent the day hiking to the most remote part of the park I could find. I figured if this entity, or whatever it was, followed me out there, I'd have a better chance of getting it on camera without any interference. As night fell, I set up my camera on a tripod and settled in to wait. Hours passed with nothing happening. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing when I heard it, that same whispering from before, but louder now. It seemed to be coming from all around me. I fumbled with my camera, trying to capture whatever was about to happen. That's when I saw her materialize about 20 feet in front of me. She looked more solid this time, less like a projection and more like an actual person. But there was still something off about her. Her eyes were too dark, her movements too fluid. She started walking toward me, her mouth moving as if she was speaking, but all I could hear was that indistinct whispering. I was frozen in place, unable to run even though every instinct was telling me to. Just as she got close enough that I could make out the details of her face, she vanished. 1 second she was there, the next, nothing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and quickly checked my camera. To my amazement, I'd managed to capture several shots of her. They weren't perfect. There was still a slightly blurred, ethereal quality to them, but it was unmistakably the same woman I'd seen. I spent the next hour reviewing the photos, my mind racing. What the hell had I just witnessed? Who was this woman? Why was she haunting this place? I was so engrossed in the pictures that I almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching from behind me. I whirled around, half expecting to see the woman again, but there was nothing there, just the empty landscape stretching out before me. The footsteps continued, though, getting closer and closer. I could hear the crunch of gravel and the rustle of grass being disturbed, but there was no visible source. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. It was like someone had placed their hand there, but when I spun around, I was still alone. That was the final straw. I grabbed my gear and ran, not caring about the direction, just needing to get away. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually I collapsed, gasping for air. As I sat there trying to catch my breath, I realized I could hear voices in the distance. At first, I thought it was more supernatural activity, but as they got closer, I recognized them as very human park rangers. I flagged them down, probably looking like a complete madman. I babbled about what had happened, showing them the photos on my camera. They exchanged worried glances and gently suggested I come back to the ranger station with them. It wasn't until we were in their truck that one of them hesitantly told me about the local legend. Apparently, back in 1871, a woman named Elizabeth Garner had been executed for witchcraft in the area that was now the park. There had been rumors for years about her ghost haunting the canyon, but most people wrote it off as campfire stories. I insisted on leaving the park immediately. The rangers seemed concerned about my mental state, but they didn't try to stop me. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman's face staring back at me. It's been weeks now, and I still can't make sense of what happened. I've had the photos analyzed, but the experts are baffled. They can't explain what's in them, but they also can't prove they're fakes. I don't know if I'll ever go back to Caprock Canyon. Part of me wants to try and understand what happened, to get more evidence. But a bigger part of me is terrified of what I might find if I do. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, and sometimes it's better not to go looking for them. I never thought I'd encounter something so terrifying and unexplainable in my life. It happened about a month ago, but I still can't shake the feeling of dread that comes over me when I think about it. I'm a 32-year-old software engineer named Ethan, and I had decided to take some time off work to go on a solo RV trip. I was feeling burnt out and needed to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life for a while. I had been on the road for about a week, meandering through small towns and scenic routes, when I decided to check out this place called Devil's Sinkhole in Texas. It sounded interesting, a massive vertical cavern in the middle of nowhere. I figured it would be a cool spot to park my RV for the night and do some stargazing. As I was driving down the long, empty road leading to the sinkhole, I started to get an eerie feeling. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. I told myself I was just being paranoid after too many days alone on the road. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Up ahead, shimmering in the fading light, was what looked like an old-fashioned wagon train. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there, a line of covered wagons slowly making their way across the desert, kicking up ghostly dust in their wake. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. As I watched in disbelief, the wagon train seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a mirage. I rubbed my eyes, but it was still there. I fumbled for my phone to try to take a picture, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even unlock the screen. Suddenly, a figure appeared right next to my driver's side window. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a man, or at least something that looked like a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes with a wide-brimmed hat. His face was gaunt and pale, with piercing eyes that seemed to glow in the twilight. "Care to join us, traveler?" he asked in a raspy voice that sent chills down my spine. I was frozen in terror, unable to speak or move. The man, or whatever he was, smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "We're always looking for new souls to join our caravan," he continued. "Eternity stretches before us, full of endless possibilities. Why limit yourself to this mundane existence when you could explore the vast unknown with us?" As he spoke, the world around me seemed to shimmer and warp. I caught glimpses of other realities, fantastic alien landscapes, glittering celestial vistas, shadowy realms that defied description. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to say yes, to abandon everything and join this otherworldly expedition. But then I remembered the small iron cross my grandmother had given me years ago, telling me it would protect me from evil. I always kept it in my wallet, more out of sentiment than belief. With trembling hands, I managed to pull it out. The moment I touched the cross, the man's face contorted in rage. He let out an inhuman shriek and recoiled as if burned. The visions disappeared, snapping me back to reality. I gunned the engine and peeled out of there as fast as I could, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I drove for hours, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel and spent a sleepless night jumping at every sound, convinced that ghostly wagon train was going to show up outside my window. In the light of day, I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. Something beyond human understanding exists out there, and I had come face to face with it. I cut my trip short and headed home after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. Even now, weeks later, I still have nightmares about that ghostly caravan and its tempter offering eternal journeys. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I think I catch glimpses of wagons in my peripheral vision. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what happened that night at Devil's Sinkhole. Part of me wants to go back there to prove to myself it wasn't real. But a bigger part of me is terrified that if I return, that sinister caravan will be waiting for me. And this time, I might not be strong enough to resist its call. I haven't told anyone else about this. Who would believe me? But I needed to get it off my chest. Has anyone else experienced anything like this? Am I going crazy? Or is there really some kind of supernatural force out there, tempting lost souls to join an eternal journey into the unknown? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at a lonely stretch of road the same way again. The experience has left me deeply shaken and questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that ghostly wagon train materialize. I've become obsessed with researching similar encounters and supernatural phenomena, desperate for some kind of explanation. But the more I dig, the more questions I have. I've read accounts of other travelers encountering strange entities in isolated areas, offering tempting but ultimately sinister bargains. Some speak of lost time, missing memories, or finding themselves miles from where they should be, with no recollection of how they got there. I've also stumbled across old legends and folklore about spectral caravans that roam the night, collecting wayward souls. The descriptions are chillingly similar to what I saw. But are these just campfire tales, or is there some grain of truth to them? I can't shake the feeling that I brushed up against something ancient and powerful that night. The rational part of my brain tries to explain it away. Maybe I dozed off at the wheel and had an extremely vivid dream. Or perhaps it was some kind of shared mass hallucination brought on by gases escaping from the sinkhole. But none of these explanations feel satisfying. Deep down, I know what I experienced was real. I find myself drawn to that iron cross now, keeping it with me at all times. It's become a talisman of sorts, my one tangible connection to that night and proof that I didn't imagine the whole thing. Sometimes I wonder, what if I hadn't had it with me? Would I have succumbed to the caravan's temptation? Where would I be now? The thought of that spectral wagon train still out there, roaming the lonely places of the world in search of new souls, haunts me. I can't help but think about all the people who might encounter it without the means to resist. Are they doomed to join that eternal, otherworldly journey? Or is there some way to banish this entity for good? I know I should probably seek professional help to process this trauma, but I'm afraid of being dismissed or labeled as delusional. And part of me worries that talking about it too much might somehow summon that caravan back. So I stay silent, carrying this burden alone. My life has changed in subtle but profound ways since that night. I find myself avoiding long road trips and isolated areas. Nighttime driving fills me with anxiety. I've become more spiritual, exploring different belief systems in search of protection and answers. But most of all, I'm left with a deep sense of unease about the nature of reality itself. If such things exist beyond our understanding, what else might be out there? How thin is the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond? And will I ever truly feel safe again, knowing what I now know? I still don't have answers, and I'm not sure I ever will. But I felt compelled to share my story, in the hopes that it might resonate with others who have experienced similar unexplainable events. If nothing else, maybe it will serve as a warning to be cautious in those liminal spaces where the fabric of reality seems to wear thin. So if you ever find yourself on a lonely road as twilight falls, and you see something flickering at the edge of your vision, don't stop, don't engage, just keep driving and hope that whatever is out there passes you by. Because once you've glimpsed what lies beyond, you can never truly unsee it. And the temptation to explore those vast unknown realms may be stronger than you think. As a travel blogger, I've been to countless breathtaking locations around the world, but Enchanted Rock in Texas had always intrigued me with its rich history and local legends. I decided it would make for a perfect feature on my blog, so I packed up my gear and hit the road, excited for what I hoped would be an inspiring adventure. The day started off normally enough. I arrived at Enchanted Rock State Natural Area early in the morning, eager to capture the sunrise over the massive pink granite dome. The air was crisp, and a light fog hung low over the landscape, giving everything an ethereal quality. Perfect for photos, I thought. I spent the morning hiking and exploring, snapping pictures and jotting down notes about the area's geology and history. Everything seemed peaceful and serene. But as the day wore on, I started to notice things that didn't quite add up. It began with a faint rhythmic sound in the distance. At first, I dismissed it as other hikers or maybe some kind of park maintenance. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded like drumming. I tried to locate the source, but it seemed to shift, sometimes sounding like it was coming from one direction, then suddenly from another. I pushed the odd occurrence to the back of my mind and continued my exploration. As I climbed higher up the rock, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Etched into a smooth section of granite was a symbol I didn't recognize, a series of interconnected spirals and lines that seemed to glow faintly in the afternoon sun. I snapped a few pictures, telling myself it was probably just graffiti from some disrespectful visitors. But deep down, something felt off about it. The real strangeness began when I started reviewing my photos from the day. In several shots of the landscape, there was a dark, hazy figure in the background. At first, I thought it was a smudge on my lens, but it appeared in multiple photos, always in a slightly different position. My hands started to shake as I zoomed in, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I approached a park ranger I saw near the visitor center. Her name tag read Jenny, and she seemed friendly enough at first. But when I mentioned the drumming sounds and showed her the photos with the strange figure, her demeanor changed completely. "Where exactly did you hear the drums?" she asked, her voice tense. I pointed towards the area where I'd been hiking earlier. Jenny's face paled. "Listen to me carefully," she said in a low voice. "You need to leave. Now. Don't go back up there, especially not after dark. And whatever you do, if you hear those drums again, don't follow them." I tried to press her for more information, but she just shook her head and walked away quickly, leaving me standing there confused and more than a little freaked out. Despite the warning, I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. I had come all this way for a story, and now it seemed like I might have stumbled onto something much bigger than I'd anticipated. I decided to stay the night in my RV, which I'd parked in the designated camping area. As darkness fell, an eerie stillness settled over the park. I sat in my RV, poring over my notes and photos from the day, trying to make sense of everything. That's when the drumming started again, louder and clearer than before. It seemed to be coming from all around me, the rhythm pulsing through the very ground beneath my feet. My heart racing, I peered out the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the landscape, and for a moment I thought I saw movement in the darkness. I blinked, and suddenly there were symbols like the one I'd seen earlier glowing faintly on the ground around my RV, forming a circle. Panic seized me. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The drumming grew louder, and then something slammed against the side of the RV with such force that it rocked on its wheels. I screamed, scrambling away from the windows. The pounding continued, each impact sending shockwaves through the vehicle. Through my terror, I realized the rhythm matched the drumming perfectly. This wasn't some animal or person outside. It was something else entirely. In a moment of desperate courage, I grabbed my camera and flung open the RV door, determined to document whatever was happening. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. Standing just beyond the circle of glowing symbols was a figure, the same hazy, dark shape from my photos, but now terrifyingly real and present. It was vaguely humanoid, but seemed to shift and waver, as if it wasn't fully part of this world. And its eyes, God, its eyes were like swirling vortexes of energy, pulling at something deep inside me. I raised my camera with shaking hands and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the night for a split second, and in that moment, the figure seemed to solidify. It took a step towards me, reaching out with a hand that was more shadow than substance. Terror unlike anything I've ever known gripped me. I slammed the RV door shut and threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tearing out of the camping area with reckless speed. As I sped away from Enchanted Rock, I could see in my rearview mirror that the glowing symbols had spread, covering the ground in intricate patterns that pulsed with an otherworldly light. The drumming reached a fevered pitch, and just before I turned onto the main road, I caught one last glimpse of that spectral figure, standing atop the granite dome, silhouetted against the starry sky. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was several towns away. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that I finally pulled over at a rest stop, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. Looking back, I still can't fully explain what happened that night at Enchanted Rock. Was it all some elaborate hoax? A hallucination brought on by dehydration or exhaustion? Or was it something truly supernatural, some ancient power awakened in that primordial landscape? I've gone over my photos and notes countless times since then, but they offer no clear answers. The photos from that final encounter are blurry and distorted, showing little more than vague shapes and strange light patterns. Part of me is grateful for that. I'm not sure I could handle seeing that figure clearly again, even in a photograph. I've tried reaching out to the park ranger, Jenny, but she seems to have vanished. No one at Enchanted Rock State Natural Area has any record of a ranger by that name working there. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those drums in my dreams. They call to me, trying to pull me back to that place. But I resist. Whatever is there, whatever ancient and powerful force dwells in Enchanted Rock, it's not meant for us to understand or control. I went looking for a story about local legends and came away with something far more terrifying and real. My advice to anyone thinking of visiting Enchanted Rock: enjoy the beauty of the place, but be wary. There are forces at work there that go beyond our comprehension. And if you hear drums in the distance, for your own sake, don't follow them. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Still can't believe what happened to us at Devil's Backbone. It's been months, but the memories haunt me every single day. I've barely slept since that camping trip, and I don't think I'll ever be the same. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my boyfriend Jason and our friends Lisa and Evan. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks, excited to explore the rugged wilderness of Devil's Backbone. None of us had ever been there before, but we'd heard it was beautiful. Steep canyons, dense forests, breathtaking views. The perfect place to disconnect from the world for a few days. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon. It was more remote than I expected. We hadn't seen another car or person for miles as we drove down the winding dirt road. As we set up our tents, I felt a strange uneasiness creep over me. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds chirping, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake off the feeling as we got a campfire going and cracked open some beers. We laughed and joked around, but I couldn't fully relax. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. A few times, I could have sworn I heard whispering coming from the trees, but when I mentioned it to the others, they said they didn't hear anything. As night fell, the forest came alive with strange sounds, odd chittering noises like no animal I'd ever heard before, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I huddled closer to Jason, trying to convince myself it was just the wind in the trees. We decided to turn in early, planning to get an early start on hiking the next day. Jason and I zipped ourselves into our tent, but I tossed and turned for hours, unable to sleep. The sounds outside seemed to be getting closer, and then I heard it, a voice clear as day, calling my name from just outside the tent. "Megan, Megan, come out and play with us." I froze, my heart pounding. It sounded exactly like Lisa's voice, but with a chilling, unnatural undertone that made my skin crawl. I shook Jason awake, whispering frantically that someone was outside. He groggily unzipped the tent and peered out, but said he didn't see anyone. I was trembling uncontrollably at this point. Jason tried to calm me down, saying I must have been dreaming, but I knew what I'd heard. As we lay there in tense silence, more voices joined in, now imitating Jason, Evan, even my own parents, all calling my name, beckoning me to come out. I buried my face in Jason's chest, squeezing my eyes shut and willing it to stop. After what felt like hours, the voices faded, and I managed to drift into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained and on edge. The others seemed cheerful as we ate breakfast, excited for our hike. I tried to bring up the strange events of the night before, but they brushed it off. Lisa joked that I must have had too much to drink. I forced a laugh, not wanting to seem crazy, but the sick feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. We set off on our hike, following a trail that wound deeper into the canyon. The scenery was stunning, but I couldn't shake my sense of dread. Every snapping twig made me jump. I kept seeing fleeting shadows darting between the trees, always just out of clear sight. About 2 hours in, we came to a fork in the trail. There was some debate about which way to go. That's when Evan suggested using his drone to scout ahead and get a better view of the landscape. We all thought it was a great idea. Evan sent the drone up, the whir of its propellers echoing through the canyon. We huddled around his controller screen, watching the aerial view. And that's when things went from unsettling to terrifying. As the drone flew over a densely wooded area, we all saw it, a dark, hunched figure moving unnaturally fast through the trees. It was only on screen for a split second before the video feed cut out. Evan frantically tried to reconnect, but the drone was gone. We all stood there in stunned silence for a moment. Lisa nervously suggested it was probably just a bear or something. But we all knew that whatever we saw didn't move like any animal. Evan was distraught about losing his expensive drone. Despite our protests, he insisted on going to look for it. We reluctantly agreed to split up. Evan and Lisa would backtrack to search for the drone, while Jason and I continued ahead on the trail. We agreed to meet back at this spot in 2 hours. Jason and I hiked on, the atmosphere between us tense and uneasy. Neither of us wanted to discuss what we'd seen on the drone footage. After about 45 minutes, we reached a scenic overlook. Any other time, I would have been awestruck by the view, but I couldn't appreciate it. I felt like we were being watched. That's when we heard Lisa's scream echoing through the canyon. Without a word, Jason and I took off running back the way we came. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Lisa's screams continued, interspersed with sounds of breaking branches and pounding footsteps. We rounded a bend in the trail and came face to face with Lisa. She was wide-eyed with terror, covered in scratches and dirt. She grabbed my arm, gasping for breath. "It took Evan," she choked out between sobs. "Oh God, it took him." Before we could process what was happening, we heard it, heavy footsteps and an inhuman growling coming towards us fast. Without thinking, we ran. I've never run so hard in my life. Branches whipped at my face as we tore through the forest, the sounds of pursuit right behind us. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but moved in a way that defied physics. jerky, impossible contortions as it bounded after us on all fours. Its skin was a sickly grayish white, and where its face should have been was just a blank, featureless expanse of flesh. I screamed and pushed myself to run faster. We burst out of the tree line back into our campsite. Jason yelled for us to get in the car. We piled in, and he gunned the engine, tires spinning in the dirt as we took off down the road. We drove for hours, not stopping until we hit the nearest town. We were all in shock, barely speaking. Lisa was nearly catatonic. We went straight to the police station to report what happened, but they were skeptical to say the least. They sent out a search party for Evan, but found no trace of him or whatever had been chasing us. It's been 3 months now. Evan is still missing, presumed dead. Lisa had a mental breakdown and is in a psychiatric facility. Jason and I broke up. He couldn't handle my constant nightmares and paranoia. I've been seeing a therapist, but nothing helps. I still hear the whispers sometimes, calling my name. I'm terrified to be alone, especially in the dark. I don't know what we encountered out there in Devil's Backbone. I don't want to know, but I'll never forget the horror of that day, or the guilt I feel for leaving Evan behind. Whatever is out there in those woods, it's not natural, and I fear it's not done with us yet. Ethan, 38 years old, and until recently I was just a normal guy living in Houston. My wife Rebecca passed away last year after a long battle with cancer, and I've been struggling to cope ever since. I thought getting away from the city and spending some time in nature might help clear my head. That's why I decided to go on a solo camping trip to Davy Crockett National Forest. I'd been there years ago with Rebecca and had fond memories of the place. I figured it would be a good spot to reflect and try to find some peace. I arrived at the forest on a Friday afternoon in late October. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool with a light breeze rustling through the autumn leaves. As I hiked to my campsite, I felt a sense of calm wash over me for the first time in months. The quiet of the forest was soothing after so much time in the noisy city. I set up my tent in a small clearing and got a campfire going as the sun started to set. Sitting by the fire that evening, watching the stars come out, I actually felt okay for the first time since Rebecca died. I even smiled a little as I remembered our past camping trips together. But as night fell fully, an uneasy feeling started to creep over me. The forest seemed to get unnaturally quiet. Even the crickets and night birds went silent. A cold wind picked up, making the trees creak and groan. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind, saying my name. Ethan! I froze, straining my ears. It came again, louder this time. Ethan! My blood ran cold as I realized it sounded just like Rebecca's voice. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding. "Rebecca!" I called out, even though I knew it was impossible. The voice came again, seeming to echo from all around me. "Ethan, come to me." I grabbed my flashlight and spun in a circle, searching the darkness beyond my campsite. The beam of light caught something moving between the trees. A flash of long dark hair and a familiar silhouette. "Rebecca!" I shouted, taking off into the woods without thinking. I crashed through the underbrush, following glimpses of that figure always just out of reach. The voice kept calling, leading me deeper into the forest. Some part of my mind was screaming that this wasn't right, but I couldn't stop myself. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Finally, I burst into a small clearing and came to an abrupt halt. There in front of me was an old, dilapidated cabin I'd never seen before. The door creaked open as I watched, and Rebecca's voice drifted out. "Ethan, I'm waiting." My legs carried me forward, even as every instinct told me to run. I stepped into the cabin, the floorboards groaning under my feet. My flashlight beams swept across dusty old furniture and cobweb-covered walls. In the center of the room was a small table, and on it lay an old leather-bound book. As if in a trance, I approached the table and opened the book. It was a journal, the pages yellow and brittle with age. I started reading, my eyes widening in horror as I took in the contents. The journal spoke of ancient forest spirits that lured people deep into the woods, never to be seen again. It described how these entities could take on the appearance of loved ones to draw their victims in. A cold chill ran down my spine as I realized what was happening. This thing using Rebecca's voice wasn't my wife. It was something else entirely, something inhuman and malevolent. I slammed the book shut and spun around, ready to flee. But there in the doorway stood Rebecca, or rather, the thing pretending to be her. In the harsh beam of my flashlight, I could see that the illusion wasn't perfect. Its eyes were too dark, its smile too wide. It reached out a hand towards me, beckoning. "Ethan, my love," it said in Rebecca's voice, but there was an unnatural echo to the words. "Stay with me. We can be together forever." I stumbled backwards, fumbling in my pocket. My fingers closed around the small bag of dried sage I always carried. Rebecca had been into New Age stuff and had insisted it would protect me. I'd kept carrying it after she died as a way to feel close to her. With shaking hands, I pulled out the sage and held it up like a shield. The effect was immediate. The Rebecca thing hissed and recoiled, its face contorting into something inhuman. The air filled with an acrid, burning smell. I seized my chance and bolted past it, out of the cabin and into the woods. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. All around me, I could hear whispers and laughter, the forest itself seeming to come alive with malevolent energy. Somehow, I found my way back to my campsite. I threw my gear into my backpack as fast as I could, not even bothering to take down the tent. As I was about to flee, I heard Rebecca's voice one last time, no longer sweet, but full of rage. "You can't escape us, Ethan. We'll be waiting." I ran to my car and drove out of that forest as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I didn't feel safe until I was back home in Houston, with the door locked behind me. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've tried to research the Davy Crockett National Forest, looking for similar stories or explanations, but I've found nothing concrete. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if grief drove me temporarily insane. But then I remember the touch of that cold, inhuman hand reaching for me, and I know it was real. I don't know what those things in the forest were or what they wanted from me. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. And if you're ever camping and hear a loved one's voice calling you into the dark, don't follow it. Run, and don't look back. My name's Ryan Fields. I'm a 39-year-old war correspondent, and I've seen some seriously messed up stuff in my line of work. Bombings, shootings, the aftermath of torture, you name it. I've probably witnessed it firsthand. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in those mountains. I decided to take a solo camping trip to Guadalupe Mountains to decompress after a particularly rough assignment. Figured some time alone in nature would help clear my head and give me a chance to process everything I'd seen. Boy, was I wrong. The first couple days were uneventful enough. I hiked during the day, set up camp in the evenings, did some writing. But on the third night, things took a turn for the bizarre. I was sitting by my campfire, jotting down some notes in my journal, when my phone suddenly went haywire. The screen started flickering and distorting, making this awful high-pitched squealing noise. I tried turning it off, but it wouldn't respond. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. The screen went black, and the phone was completely dead. Unsettled, I decided to turn in early. But as I was zipping up my tent, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A tall, unnaturally thin figure standing at the edge of the firelight. And its face. God, that face. It had this horrifically wide grin that stretched literally from ear to ear. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself I was just overtired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, I woke to find my backpack had been torn open and ransacked. Food, water, my compass, all gone. But strangely, my camera and journal were left untouched. I started to feel a deep sense of unease, like I was being watched. As I hiked that day, trying to find my way back to the trailhead, I kept seeing flashes of movement in my peripheral vision. That unnatural figure, always just out of sight. And I swear I could hear faint whispers on the wind, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. By late afternoon, I was hopelessly lost. The trail markers seemed to have vanished, and the terrain looked completely unfamiliar. Panic started to set in as I realized I might have to spend another night out here. That's when I saw it again. The figure with the grotesque smile, standing motionless about 50 yards away. This time, I got a better look. It was unnaturally tall, at least 8 feet, with limbs that were far too long and thin to be human. Its skin was a sickly grayish white, like a corpse. And that smile, rows of needle-sharp teeth in a mouth that split its face in two. I froze, heart pounding. The thing just stood there, staring at me with black, empty eyes. Then it spoke, in a voice that seemed to come from inside my own head. "Ryan Fields, we've been waiting for you." I ran. I ran faster and harder than I ever have in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Branches whipped at my face, and I nearly twisted my ankle a dozen times, but I didn't dare slow down. After what felt like hours, I collapsed, gasping for breath. Night had fallen, and I found myself in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with horror that I wasn't alone. The creature was there, mere feet away. But now there were others with it, more of those grotesque, smiling abominations. They formed a circle around me, closing in slowly. That's when the whispering started again, but this time I could understand the words. They were speaking of all the horrors I'd witnessed as a war correspondent. Bombings, executions, mass graves. Every terrible memory came flooding back in vivid detail. But it wasn't just the events themselves. I could feel the fear, the pain, the anguish of every victim I'd ever photographed or interviewed. It was overwhelming, like drowning in a sea of other people's suffering. I curled into a ball, hands pressed against my ears, trying desperately to block it out. But the voices only grew louder, more insistent. And with them came visions, not just of what I'd seen, but things I'd only heard about or imagined. I saw children being torn apart by shrapnel. I saw women being brutalized by soldiers. I saw piles of bodies left to rot in the sun. And through it all, those smiling faces watched, feeding on my fear and guilt. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped in that nightmare. It felt like days, weeks even. I was certain I would die there, my mind shattered by the onslaught of horrors. But then, just as I was about to give up hope entirely, something inside me snapped. A surge of anger and defiance rose up, drowning out the fear. I forced myself to my feet, fists clenched, and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Enough! I won't let you break me!" The creatures recoiled, their smiles faltering for the first time. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stood there, chest heaving, glaring at each of those twisted faces in turn. "I've seen humanity at its worst," I snarled. "I've looked true evil in the eye. Whatever the hell you things are, you don't scare me." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the circle of creatures began to widen. A gap appeared between two of them, an opening. Without hesitation, I bolted through it. I ran and ran, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to blur around me, trees and rocks melting into a dark smear. And then suddenly, impossibly, I burst out onto a familiar trail. The main path leading back to the park entrance was right there in front of me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the door and throw myself inside. As I sped away from Guadalupe Mountains, the sun was just starting to rise. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and that place as I could. It's been weeks now, and I still can't fully process what happened to me out there. Was it all some kind of hallucination brought on by dehydration and exhaustion? A psychotic break triggered by PTSD? Or did I truly encounter something beyond human understanding? I don't know. But I do know this. I'll never set foot in those mountains again. And every time I close my eyes, I see those horrible smiling faces waiting in the darkness. I've faced a lot of dangers in my career, but nothing has ever shaken me like this. I thought I knew what true fear was, but I was wrong. There are things in this world far more terrifying than any war or disaster I've covered. And sometimes, the most frightening battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. It was supposed to be a routine camping trip in Sam Houston National Forest. As a travel blogger, I'm always looking for new outdoor experiences to write about. At 34, I've done my fair share of solo camping, so I wasn't worried about heading out on my own for a few days. I had all my gear packed up: tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, the works. I even brought my good camera to get some shots for the blog. The first day went smoothly enough. I hiked a few miles in, found a nice clearing to set up camp, and spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding woods. As the sun started to set, I headed back to make dinner and settle in for the night. That's when things started to feel off. At first, it was just little things. I could have sworn I left my water bottle by the tent, but suddenly it was on the other side of the campsite. My backpack seemed to have shifted position slightly. Probably just my imagination, I told myself. As darkness fell, the forest got unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just a heavy silence pressing in around me. I tried to shake off my unease and focus on getting a fire going. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Carol." I froze. How did it know my name? I must have imagined it. I'm Carol Linfield, but I hadn't told anyone out here my name. I hadn't seen another soul all day. I tried to busy myself with camp tasks, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more distinct. They seemed to know things about me: childhood memories, secret fears, thoughts I'd never told anyone. It was like they were inside my head. "Remember when you broke Mom's favorite vase, Carol? You blamed it on the cat. You're scared of drowning. Always have been, ever since that day at the lake. You wish you'd told him how you felt before he moved away. Now it's too late." My heart was racing. This wasn't possible. I considered packing up and hiking out right then, but it was too dark. I'd have to wait until morning. As I huddled in my tent that night, things only got worse. Shadows moved in impossible ways outside, bending and twisting unnaturally. Objects would vanish when I looked away, only to reappear somewhere else moments later. The whispers grew to a cacophony, 100 voices talking over each other, all of them knowing things they shouldn't. I must have dozed off eventually from sheer exhaustion. When I woke, watery morning light was filtering through the tent walls. For a moment, I hoped it had all been a bad dream. Then I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. My entire campsite was rearranged. The fire pit had moved. My backpack hung from a tree branch 20 feet up. And there, burned into the trunk of a massive oak, was my name. I'd had enough. I frantically started gathering my things, not even bothering to pack neatly. I just wanted out of there. That's when I saw them, dark, shadowy figures at the edge of the clearing. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, movements too fluid. As I watched in horror, they started to change. Features began to form, familiar features. I saw my mother's face, my childhood best friend, my first boyfriend. But their eyes were all wrong, black and empty. They called out to me in the voices of people I knew, begging me to come with them, to join them. But there was a coldness beneath the familiar tones that chilled me to my core. I ran. I didn't even know which direction I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The figures pursued, always just at the edge of my vision. Their calls echoed through the trees, using my memories against me, trying to lure me in. "Carol, honey, come back. Don't you want to see Mommy?" "Hey, Carol, remember that time we snuck out to the concert? Let's go on another adventure." I stumbled through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, my lungs burning. I didn't dare look back. I could feel them getting closer. In desperation, I pulled out my camera. I'd read once that spirits could sometimes be seen in photographs. Maybe the flash would drive them back. I spun around, snapping picture after picture wildly. To my shock, it worked. In the brief bursts of light, I could see the entities recoiling, their forms dispersing like smoke. It gave me the chance I needed. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, not stopping until I broke through the tree line and saw my car parked at the trailhead. I peeled out of there, tires squealing. I didn't slow down until I was miles away on the highway. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I kept expecting to see those things in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing. It's been weeks now, and I still can't explain what happened out there. The scratches on my arms and face from my frantic flight through the woods have mostly healed, but the memories haven't faded. I still have nightmares about those voices, those shadowy figures with familiar faces. I developed the photos from that day, half expecting them to show nothing. But there they are, blurry, dark shapes, warped and inhuman. Proof that I'm not crazy, that something was out there. I don't know what those things were or what they wanted with me. I don't know why they seemed to know so much about my life. All I know is that I'll never set foot in Sam Houston National Forest again. Some places are better left unexplored. If you're planning a camping trip there, please be careful. And if you hear whispers in the night that know your name, run. Don't look back. Just run. It was supposed to be a fun adventure. Just me, Jake, and Sam spending a long weekend exploring the Chisos Mountains. We'd been planning it for months, poring over trail maps and gushing about the epic views we'd see. I was so excited to get away from the city and clear my head in nature. The first day was everything we'd hoped for. We set up camp near the base of Emery Peak, surrounded by towering rock formations and scrubby desert vegetation. As the sun set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, We sat around the campfire trading stories and dreaming about the hikes we'd do over the next few days. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. We were huddled around the fire again when Jake suddenly went quiet mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something in the darkness beyond our campsite. When I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said it was probably nothing. But I noticed how tense he seemed for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jake was adamant about doing a drone flight to scout out the area. He claimed it was just to get some cool aerial footage, but I could tell he was looking for something specific. Sam and I exchanged confused glances as Jake meticulously programmed a flight path into his controller. We watched the drone take off and disappear into the clear blue sky. Jake's eyes were glued to the controller screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. After about 15 minutes, his whole body suddenly went rigid. "What the fuck is that?" he muttered, zooming in on something. Before Sam or I could ask what he meant, Jake's eyes went wide with panic. Oh shit, he yelled, frantically working the controller. "I'm losing signal. Come on. The drone's video feed cut to static. Jake cursed and tried desperately to regain control, but it was no use. Whatever he'd seen out there, the drone was gone. Jake was visibly shaken. When we pressed him on what he'd spotted, he just shook his head and said we needed to pack up and leave immediately. But Sam and I convinced him we should at least try to retrieve the drone first. It was expensive equipment after all. So we set out in the direction Jake had last seen it, with him leading the way. The further we got from camp, the more on edge Jake became. He kept glancing around nervously, as if expecting something to jump out at us at any moment. We'd been hiking for about an hour when Jake suddenly froze in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I was about to say no when an inhuman shriek pierced the air. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a blood-curdling mix of a mountain lion's scream and a person in agony. Before I could even process what was happening, Jake took off running back the way we'd come. "Run!" he yelled over his shoulder. "Don't look back, just fucking run." Pure adrenaline and terror propelled me forward. I could hear Sam's ragged breathing beside me as we sprinted after Jake. That awful shriek echoed through the mountains again, closer this time. The sound of something large crashing through the underbrush behind us sent a jolt of primal fear through my body. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. What I saw defied explanation. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but much larger, at least 8 feet tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long and spindly, with razor-sharp claws at the ends. But it was the face that will haunt me forever. It was like a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. Bulging eyes, an elongated snout full of jagged teeth, and antlers protruding from its skull. I let out a scream and pushed myself to run faster than I ever had in my life. Up ahead, I could see Jake duck behind a large boulder. Sam and I made a beeline for it, diving behind the rock, just as another ear-splitting shriek rent the air. We huddled there, gasping for breath, as the sound of heavy footsteps and snapping branches drew closer. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle my panicked breathing. Jake had his arm around Sam, who was trembling uncontrollably. The footsteps stopped. For several agonizing seconds, the only sound was our ragged breathing and my thundering heartbeat. Then a low, guttural growl came from directly above us. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain we were about to die. But after what felt like an eternity, the growling faded and the footsteps receded into the distance. We stayed frozen in place for at least another 10 minutes before Jake finally whispered that we should make a run for camp. On shaking legs, we emerged from our hiding spot and started the trek back. We'd only gone about 100 yards when Sam let out a strangled cry. Following his gaze, I saw Jake's mangled drone hanging from a tree branch. Next to it was what looked horribly like a human arm, stripped of flesh. That was enough for us. We sprinted back to camp, grabbed our essentials, and got the hell out of there. The entire drive back to civilization, we barely spoke. What was there to say? We'd encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that defied rational explanation. In the months since, I've struggled to make sense of what happened. I've researched cryptids and local legends, trying to find anything that matches what we saw. The closest I've come is the Wendigo of Algonquin folklore, but even that doesn't quite fit. Jake refuses to talk about it at all. Sam threw himself into work and rarely responds to my messages anymore. And me? I haven't been able to shake the feeling that we're being watched. Sometimes at night, I swear I hear that inhuman shriek in the distance. I know how crazy this all sounds. Part of me still wonders if it was some kind of shared delusion brought on by fear and isolation. But then I remember the primal terror I felt when I saw that thing. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes. It was real. And it's still out there. So if you're planning a trip to Big Bend, or any remote wilderness really, be careful. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that lurk in the shadows waiting to prey on the unsuspecting. I used to scoff at stories like this. Now I know better. The truth is far more terrifying than any campfire tale. My name's Mark, and I'm a 42-year-old geologist. After my divorce last year, I decided to take a solo trip to Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area in Texas. I needed to clear my head, and I figured exploring some unique geological formations might reignite my passion for my work. I arrived at the site early in the morning, my RV packed with supplies for a few days of camping and research. The sinkhole itself was breathtaking, a massive vertical cavern plunging over 350 feet into the earth. As I set up my equipment near the rim, I felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly what I needed, but almost immediately, things started to feel off. My phone kept glitching, the screen flickering with strange symbols before dying completely. I shrugged it off as some kind of interference from the cave system and continued setting up my gear. As the day wore on, I noticed the air getting heavier, almost oppressive. The usual chatter of birds and insects fell silent, replaced by an eerie stillness. I tried to focus on my work, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around dusk, I witnessed something that still makes my skin crawl. A column of bats erupted from the sinkhole, normal enough for the area, but their formation was like nothing I'd ever seen. They swirled in impossible patterns, creating shapes that seemed to defy physics. For a moment, I swear I saw a face form in the living cloud of bats, its eyes locked onto mine. I stumbled back, heart racing. This wasn't natural. Something was very, very wrong here. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from the depths of the sinkhole. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The noise grew louder, reverberating through the ground beneath my feet. Panic set in. I scrambled to pack up my equipment, fumbling with trembling hands. As I turned to head back to my RV, movement caught my eye. A dark shape was crawling out of the sinkhole, defying gravity as it scaled the vertical walls. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life. I made it to my RV and locked myself inside, peering out the windows with wide eyes. The sun had set, plunging the area into darkness. I could hear something moving outside, scratching noises along the sides of the vehicle, whispering voices, too quiet to make out the words. I was trapped. My hands shook as I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. That's when I remembered. I had picked up an old book from a tiny antique shop on my way here. The shopkeeper had been eager to get rid of it, practically giving it away. I hadn't paid it much attention, but now, maybe it held some answers. I found the book buried in my bag and opened it with trembling hands. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, drawings of terrifying creatures emerging from chasms in the earth. As I flipped through, a chill ran down my spine. The images, they looked just like what I had seen at the sinkhole. Suddenly, the whispers outside grew louder. I could make out words now. "Mark, we know you're in there, Mark. You shouldn't have come here, shouldn't have brought the book. There's a price to pay." How did they know my name? What price? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The scratching intensified, and I saw dark shapes moving past the windows. Shadows that shouldn't exist, taking forms that defied reality. I knew I couldn't stay in the RV. They would find a way in eventually. With the book clutched to my chest, I took a deep breath and burst out the door, running blindly into the darkness. The world around me had changed. The familiar landscape of the state park was gone, replaced by a twisted version of reality. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy and uneven. Strange rock formations loomed in the darkness, their shapes seeming to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And the entities, God, the entities. They pursued me relentlessly. I caught glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, writhing masses of shadow, vaguely humanoid but wrong in ways I can't describe. Their whispers grew to shrieks, demanding that I pay the price for disturbing their domain. I ran until my lungs burned, stumbling through this nightmare landscape. Somehow, I found myself back at the rim of the sinkhole. The entities were closing in, their cold presence at my back. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the book into the depths of the sinkhole. The reaction was immediate. A howl of rage erupted from the chasm, so loud it nearly knocked me off my feet. The shadows pursuing me writhed in apparent agony. Taking advantage of their distraction, I pulled out my lighter and set fire to the pages I had torn from the book in my panic. As the paper burned, the world around me seemed to waver and distort. The shadows retreated, their shrieks fading into the distance. Slowly, reality reasserted itself. I found myself standing alone at the edge of the sinkhole, the first rays of dawn peeking over the horizon. I didn't wait around to see if the entities would return. I ran back to my RV, threw my belongings inside, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away from Devil's Sinkhole. It's been months since that night, and I still can't explain what happened. Was it all a hallucination? Some kind of mass hysteria brought on by stress and isolation? But the terror I felt was real. The book was real, though I've never been able to find any information about its origins. I've tried to move on with my life, but the memories of that night haunt me. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear those whispers again. I've never gone back to Devil's Sinkhole. I never will. Whatever is down there, whatever I accidentally disturbed, it's better left alone. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I experienced that night. And I'll never forget the price I almost had to pay for my curiosity. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, spend a few days exploring the area, take some photos, and write up a nice piece about the rugged beauty of the Texas wilderness. I arrived at the park early in the morning, excited to start my adventure. The scenery was breathtaking, crystal clear water flowing through limestone canyons, surrounded by arid scrubland. I set up camp near the river and spent the day hiking and scouting locations for photos. As evening approached, I was sitting by my tent reviewing my notes when I noticed another camper setting up nearby. Always eager to chat with locals and get insider tips, I wandered over to introduce myself. That's when I met Becky Turner. Becky was a petite woman in her 40s with wild curly hair and an intense gaze. She explained that she was a paranormal investigator who had come to Devil's River to research a phenomenon known as the Devil's Light. According to her, there had been numerous sightings over the years of strange, otherworldly lights appearing over the river at night. I have to admit, I was skeptical. In my line of work, I've heard plenty of local legends and tall tales. But Becky seemed absolutely convinced. She spoke rapidly, her eyes gleaming with excitement as she rattled off dates and details of past sightings. It's not just lights, she insisted. People have reported seeing shadowy figures within the lights. Some say they've heard voices calling to them from the river. A few have even claimed the lights tried to lure them into the water. I nodded politely, not wanting to offend her, but also not putting much stock in ghost stories. We chatted for a bit longer before I excused myself to get some dinner started. As I walked back to my campsite, I glanced over my shoulder and saw Becky setting up some kind of equipment, cameras and sensors, I assumed. That night, I lay in my tent, unable to sleep. The unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness kept startling me awake. Rustling in the bushes, the hoot of an owl, the babbling of the river. Around 2 a.m. I heard Becky moving around outside. Curious, I unzipped my tent and peered out. She was standing by the river's edge, her equipment arrayed around her. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. I watched as Becky walked slowly along the bank, stopping occasionally to adjust her devices. Suddenly, she froze. Even from a distance, I could see her body go rigid. She turned her head sharply, staring intently at something out on the water. I followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual, just moonlight reflecting off the gently flowing river. Becky started gesturing wildly and speaking, though I couldn't make out the words. She took a few steps into the shallows. Alarmed, I called out to her, "Becky, what are you doing?" She didn't seem to hear me. She waded in deeper, the water now up to her waist. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. "Becky, stop!" I shouted. "Come back!" Just as I reached the riverbank, Becky disappeared beneath the surface. I stood there in shock for a moment, waiting for her to resurface. But the river remained calm and still. Panicking, I splashed into the water, searching desperately in the dark. I dove under repeatedly, groping blindly in the murky depths, but found nothing. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I stumbled back to shore, gasping and shivering. I ran to my tent and grabbed my phone to call for help. But of course, no signal. I was alone in the wilderness with no way to contact the outside world. I paced frantically along the bank, calling Becky's name over and over. But there was no response except the steady gurgle of the river. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, I collapsed on the ground, exhausted and terrified. What had I just witnessed? Had Becky drowned? But how could she have vanished so quickly, without a sound or struggle? I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the sun was up. I jolted awake, the memories of the night before crashing over me. I ran to Becky's campsite, hoping against hope that it had all been a nightmare. But her tent was empty, her sleeping bag untouched. I spent the morning searching up and down the riverbank, looking for any sign of Becky or her equipment. But there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no bits of clothing or gear. It was as if she had never existed. I knew I needed to report what had happened, but I was scared. How could I explain what I'd seen? Would anyone believe me? I decided to hike out to the ranger station and let the authorities handle it. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking as I broke down my tent. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. There, half buried in the mud by the river, was one of Becky's devices, a small black box with blinking lights. I hesitated, then grabbed it and shoved it in my backpack. Maybe it would help explain what had happened. The hike to the ranger station was grueling. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, and I was running on zero sleep and frayed nerves. By the time I arrived, I was dehydrated and barely coherent. I stammered out my story to the bewildered park ranger, who immediately called in search and rescue. The next few days passed in a blur. I was questioned repeatedly by rangers, police, and search teams. They combed the area but found no trace of Becky or her campsite. I handed over the device I'd found, but the authorities seemed skeptical of my entire story. I could tell they thought I was either crazy or hiding something. Finally, after 3 days, they told me I was free to go. The search was ongoing, but they had no reason to hold me. I numbly gathered my belongings and began the long drive home. That should have been the end of it. A tragic, inexplicable event that would haunt me, yes, but one I could eventually move past. But what happened next made me realize the nightmare was far from over. About a week after I returned home, I woke in the middle of the night to a strange glow coming from outside my bedroom window. Heart racing, I crept to the glass and peered out. There, hovering above my backyard, was a pulsing orb of light. I froze, unable to breathe. The light slowly began to take shape, morphing into a vaguely human-like form, and then I heard it, a voice, eerily familiar, calling my name. Ellie, Ellie, come to me. It was Becky's voice. I scrambled away from the window, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. I was safe at home, hundreds of miles from Devil's River. But the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. Against my better judgment, I found myself moving towards the back door. It was like I was in a trance, my body no longer under my control. I stepped outside, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my skin. The glowing figure was clearer now. I could make out Becky's features, but distorted, almost melting. Her eyes were hollow voids that seemed to draw me in. She reached out a shimmering arm towards me. "Join us, Ellie," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "We're waiting for you in the river." Behind her, I could see other spectral forms taking shape, shadowy figures with glowing eyes, all beckoning to me. I took a stumbling step forward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refusing to obey. Just as I was about to take another step, a car alarm went off down the street. The harsh blaring snapped me out of my trance. I turned and ran back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside again, the lights and figures were gone. The backyard was dark and still. I'd like to say that was the last of it, but the truth is, I still see the lights sometimes. Out of the corner of my eye, reflected in windows or mirrors, I hear whispers on the wind calling my name. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I can hear the sound of rushing water. I don't know what really happened at Devil's River. I don't know if Becky is dead or if she's become something else. All I know is that ever since that night, I've felt like something is watching me, waiting, and I'm terrified that one day I won't be strong enough to resist when it calls me back to the river. It was supposed to be a routine assignment. Spend a week capturing images of the local flora and fauna for a nature magazine. Cato Lake had always intrigued me with its pristine beauty and diverse ecosystem. As I drove into the small town nearby, I was eager to get started. The first hint that something was off came when I stopped at the local diner for lunch. As I chatted with the waitress about good spots for wildlife viewing, her friendly demeanor suddenly changed. She lowered her voice and warned me to be careful out there, especially after dark. According to her, there were old legends about a witch that haunted the lake, luring unsuspecting victims to their doom. I brushed it off as small-town superstition. After all, I was a rational guy who dealt in facts and physical evidence. Ghost stories didn't scare me. If anything, it just made me more determined to capture the raw, natural beauty of the area. That first day went smoothly as I scouted locations and took some test shots. The lake was even more breathtaking in person, crystal clear waters reflecting the dense forest and craggy mountains. As the sun began to set, I decided to try for some dusk shots near the shore. That's when I heard it for the first time. A haunting melody drifting across the water. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, ethereal and mesmerizing. I found myself moving closer to the water's edge, straining to make out the source. But as quickly as it began, the song faded away, leaving only the usual sounds of the forest at twilight. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I headed back to my cabin. It was probably just the wind playing tricks, I told myself, but deep down I knew it was something more. The next few days passed in a blur as I immersed myself in my work. I captured some incredible shots of ospreys diving for fish, a family of otters at play, and even a majestic bull moose at dawn. But each night as darkness fell, that eerie song would start up again. Sometimes it seemed to come from right offshore, other times from deep in the woods. I never could pinpoint the source. On the fourth night, things took a terrifying turn. I had set up my gear for some long exposure night sky shots, hoping to capture the Milky Way reflected in the still waters of the lake. As I waited for the camera timer, movement on the water caught my eye. At first I thought it was just ripples from the breeze, but then I saw her, a pale, ethereal figure of a woman, seemingly floating just above the surface. Her long hair billowed around her as if underwater, even though she was clearly above the waves. And her eyes, God, her eyes were locked right on me, glowing with an otherworldly light. I watched in stunned silence as she drifted closer to shore. That unearthly song filled the air again, but this time I could tell it was coming directly from her. Part of me wanted to run screaming back to my cabin, but another part felt drawn to her, compelled to move closer to the water's edge. Just as I took a step forward, my camera's shutter clicked loudly, breaking the spell. In an instant, the figure vanished and the song cut off abruptly. I was left standing alone in the darkness, heart pounding and hands shaking. I barely slept that night, convinced I was losing my mind. But when I checked my camera the next morning, there she was, a blurry but unmistakable figure hovering above the lake in several frames. I had proof that I wasn't hallucinating, but that almost made it worse. I should have packed up and left right then, but something kept me there, a mix of professional curiosity and a deep-seated need to understand what was happening. So I stayed, but I was much more cautious now, especially after dark. The encounters continued over the next 2 nights. Sometimes just glimpses of movement in the mist. Other times that bone-chilling song echoing through the trees. I didn't see the spectral woman again directly, but I felt her presence constantly. It was as if she was toying with me, always just out of sight. On my last night at Cato Lake, I decided to face my fears head-on. I planned a final photo expedition, hiking to a secluded cove on the far side of the lake. As I set up my equipment in the fading light, that familiar melody began. But this time it was louder, more insistent. I turned to see the woman floating mere yards away, her ethereal form flickering like candlelight. She beckoned to me, her song more alluring than ever. I found myself moving towards her without even realizing it, drawn by some primal urge I couldn't resist. The icy water was up to my knees before I snapped out of it. I stumbled backwards, falling onto the rocky shore. The woman's beautiful face contorted into a horrifying snarl. She lunged towards me with inhuman speed, spectral hands grasping. Pure terror gave me strength, and I scrambled to my feet, sprinting back towards the trail. I could hear splashing behind me, as if something was emerging from the lake in pursuit. I didn't look back, just ran blindly through the woods until I reached my cabin. I threw my gear into the car and peeled out of there, driving straight through the night until I was hundreds of miles away. It wasn't until I reached home that I dared to look at the photos from that final night. What I saw chilled me to the bone. In frame after frame, that ghostly woman was there in the background, sometimes just a blur, other times in crystal clear focus. But the most disturbing shot was the last one. It showed me standing knee-deep in the water, a look of rapture on my face as spectral hands reached for my throat. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't broken free of her spell, but I do know that I'll never set foot near Cato Lake again. The magazine didn't get their story. I told them equipment failure ruined the shoot. I couldn't bring myself to share those photos or my experience with anyone until now. Sometimes late at night, I still hear echoes of that otherworldly song in my dreams, and I wonder how many others have been lured to their doom in those haunted waters over the years. The myths and legends suddenly don't seem so impossible anymore. Whatever is out there, it's very real and very dangerous. I just count myself lucky to have escaped with my life and my sanity mostly intact. I went on what was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends Tyler and Liz in Caprock Canyon last month. I've always loved the outdoors, but after what happened there, I don't think I'll ever be able to go camping again. The 3 of us had been planning this trip for weeks. We were all excited to get away from the city for a few days and explore the beautiful canyon landscape. Tyler had just bought a new drone and was eager to get some aerial footage of the scenery. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon and set up our tents. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain, we gathered around the campfire to roast marshmallows and chat. Everything seemed so peaceful and normal. If only I had known what horrors awaited us. The next morning, we woke up early to do some hiking. Tyler brought along his drone and spent some time flying it around to capture video of the stunning red rock formations. At one point, he flew it a bit too far and lost sight of it. He thought he saw where it went down, so he headed off to try to retrieve it while Liz and I continued on the trail. When Tyler didn't return after an hour, we started to get worried. We called out for him, but got no response. As we retraced our steps looking for him, an eerie silence settled over the canyon. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. A chill ran down my spine despite the hot Texas sun beating down on us. We searched for hours with no sign of Tyler. Just as we were about to head back to camp to call for help, Liz spotted something in the distance. Tyler's backpack lying on the ground near the base of a cliff. We rushed over, hoping to find him nearby, but he was nowhere to be seen. That's when I noticed the strange markings carved into the rock face. They looked ancient, crude stick figures and bizarre symbols that made no sense to me. And then I saw the bones. Scattered around the area were what looked like animal bones, along with a few that seemed disturbingly human-like. My heart was racing as I took in the nightmarish scene. What the hell had happened here? Where was Tyler? I turned to Liz, seeing the same fear and confusion in her eyes that I felt. Suddenly, we heard a blood-curdling shriek echo through the canyon. It didn't sound human or like any animal I'd ever heard. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a wave of pure terror washed over me. We need to get out of here. Now. I grabbed Liz's arm and we took off running back towards our campsite. As we ran, I heard heavy footsteps and labored breathing behind us, getting closer. I was too terrified to look back. We sprinted as fast as we could, our lungs burning, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. Finally, we burst into the clearing where our tents were set up. Without stopping, we grabbed our backpacks and kept running towards where we had parked the car. That's when I saw it, just for a split second as I glanced over my shoulder. A tall, emaciated figure with grayish skin stretched taut over an elongated skull. Its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth and its eyes. God, those glowing red eyes will haunt me forever. Liz fumbled with the car keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I could hear the thing crashing through the trees, getting closer by the second. Just as it emerged at the edge of the campsite, Liz got the car started, and we peeled out of there, kicking up a cloud of dust. We drove for hours in silence, both of us too shocked and terrified to speak. When we finally got cell service again, we called the police and park rangers to report Tyler missing. They searched for days but never found any trace of him. It's been a month now, and I still have nightmares every night about what I saw in that canyon. I've done some research since then and learned about a creature from Native American folklore called a Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that possesses humans and turns them into cannibalistic monsters. I don't know if that's what we encountered, but I can't shake the feeling that Tyler fell victim to something truly evil out there. Liz and I have tried to move on with our lives, but we're both permanently changed by what happened. The guilt of leaving Tyler behind eats away at me every day, and the terror of knowing that thing is still out there somewhere. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I know this all sounds insane. Most people probably won't believe me. Hell, some days I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and I'll carry the trauma of that day with me for the rest of my life. I'm sharing this as a warning to anyone thinking of camping in Caprock Canyon. Please, be careful out there. And if you hear strange noises or see any weird symbols carved in the rocks, get out immediately. Don't make the same mistake we did. Don't let your curiosity get the better of you. Some things in this world are better left undisturbed. I often wonder if we could have done anything differently to save Tyler. The rational part of my brain knows there's no way we could have fought off that monster. But the guilt still gnaws at me. His family deserves closure, but I can't bring myself to tell them the full truth of what happened. How could they possibly understand? Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I swear I can hear that inhuman shriek again in the distance. I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but it sends me into a panic every time. I've started sleeping with the lights on, and keeping a baseball bat by my bed. Liz and I have drifted apart since the incident. I think seeing each other just brings back too many painful memories. We both blame ourselves for Tyler's fate. I often find myself obsessively poring over maps of the canyon, trying to pinpoint exactly where we were when it all went wrong, as if somehow retracing our steps could undo what happened. I've become paranoid about going anywhere remote or isolated now. Even a simple hike in a local park fills me with dread. Every snapping twig or rustling leaves makes me jump. I keep expecting to see those glowing red eyes staring at me from the shadows. The worst part is not knowing for sure what became of Tyler. Did that thing eat him? Is he somehow still alive out there, transformed into one of those creatures? The not knowing is almost worse than if we'd found his body. His family still holds out hope that he'll be found someday. I don't have the heart to crush that hope, even though I know the truth is far worse than they could imagine. I've tried therapy, but it's hard to work through trauma that no one believes is real. How do you process an encounter with something that shouldn't exist? I feel so isolated, carrying this burden that I can't fully share with anyone. Sometimes I wonder if we somehow unleashed that thing by disturbing the area with Tyler's drone. Or maybe it was always there, lying in wait for unsuspecting victims. Either way, I can't shake the feeling that we were meant to encounter it that day, like we were led there for some sinister purpose. I know I'll never get answers to all the questions that haunt me. All I can do now is try to warn others and hope that no one else has to experience the terror we did in Caprock Canyon. If you're reading this and planning a trip there, please reconsider. Some places are better left unexplored, and some creatures are better left undisturbed in the dark corners of the world where they dwell. Stay safe out there, and always trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right. We ignored the warning signs until it was too late. Don't make our mistake. The wilderness may be beautiful, but it can also hide unimaginable horrors. Horrors that have left an indelible mark on my soul and forever changed how I see the world. Just moved to this small town in northern Wisconsin for work. Didn't know a soul here and was feeling pretty lonely and isolated. One Friday night, I decided to check out the local dive bar, figuring I could at least drown my sorrows, if nothing else. The place was dimly lit and smoky, with just a handful of grizzled regulars nursing beers at the bar. I grabbed a stool and ordered a whiskey, planning to have a couple drinks and head home. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting alone at the end of the bar, wearing a bright yellow blouse that stood out in the dark tavern. Long dark hair, pale skin, absolutely gorgeous. Way out of place in a dump like this. Our eyes met, and she gave me a little smile that made my heart skip. Before I knew it, I was sliding onto the stool next to her, introducing myself. Her name was Lily. We got to talking, and the conversation flowed easily. She was funny and charming, with these piercing green eyes I couldn't look away from. The drinks kept coming as we chatted and laughed. I'm not usually the type to get wasted, but something about Lily made me want to keep the night going. Maybe it was the loneliness, or just being mesmerized by her. Either way, I threw back whiskey after whiskey as we talked. The hours flew by in a blur. At some point, Lily said she had to go. I was far too drunk to drive, so I decided to walk home. It was only a couple miles through the woods. I figured I could handle it even in my inebriated state. I stumbled out of the bar around 2 a.m. The cool night air hit me and I realized just how hammered I was. The world was spinning as I started down the dark forest path towards my apartment. Stupid idea, but drunk me wasn't exactly thinking straight. The woods were pitch black and eerily quiet. Just the crunch of leaves under my unsteady feet. I kept tripping over roots and stumps. At one point I fell hard, scraping up my hands and knees. But I pushed on, wanting to get home and pass out. That's when I saw her again. Lily, standing in a small clearing up ahead, her yellow blouse glowing in the moonlight filtering through the trees. What the hell was she doing out here? "Lily," I called out, my words slurring. "That you? What are you doing here?" She didn't respond, just stood there motionless. As I got closer, something felt off. Her posture was rigid, unnatural, and her face, it was blank, expressionless. Not the warm, friendly woman from the bar. A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run. But the alcohol had dulled my senses. I took another step closer. "Lily, you okay?" I asked nervously. Suddenly, her head snapped towards me with inhuman speed. Her eyes were pitch black, empty voids. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I sobered up real quick. Pure terror coursed through me as I stumbled backwards. This thing wearing Lily's face let out an ear-piercing shriek and lunged at me with terrifying speed. I turned and ran blindly into the woods, branches whipping my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear it right behind me, that awful shrieking getting closer. My legs felt like jelly, my lungs burning, but sheer adrenaline and fear kept me going. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was mere feet away, its face now a horrific, inhuman mask. Long, clawed fingers reached for me. I let out a scream and pushed myself to run faster. In my panic, I didn't see the slope ahead. My foot caught on a root, and I went tumbling down the hill, crashing through ferns and brambles. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and winded. As I struggled to my feet, I saw the creature advancing down the hill towards me. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with broken strings. Terror gripped me. I was cornered. My hand closed around a large rock on the ground. As the thing that looked like Lily got closer, I gripped the stone tightly. It was my only chance. When it was just a few feet away, I mustered all my strength and swung the rock with everything I had. There was a sickening crack as it connected with the creature's skull. It crumpled to the ground, twitching. I didn't wait to see if it would get back up. I turned and ran as fast as my battered body would allow, not stopping until I reached the edge of town. Only then did I pause to catch my breath, hands on my knees as I gasped for air. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what just happened hit me. Oh God, had I killed someone? Was it really Lily, and I'd imagined the whole monster thing in my drunken state? Panic set in. I needed to go back and check, make sure she was okay or call for help if she wasn't. But the thought of returning to those dark woods filled me with dread. What if the creature was still out there? In the end, my fear won out. I stumbled home and spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, jumping at every little sound. Sleep was impossible. The next day, racked with guilt, I finally worked up the courage to return to the woods. Hungover and sore, I retraced my steps to where I thought the confrontation had happened. But there was nothing there. No body, no blood, not even any signs of a struggle. It was like the whole thing never happened. I've gone back several times since, searching for any evidence. But I've found nothing. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, some kind of alcohol-induced hallucination. But then I look at the cuts and bruises on my body, feel the lingering terror, and I know it was real. I haven't seen Lily since that night. I asked around town, but no one seems to know her or remember seeing her at the bar. It's like she vanished into thin air. I don't go out drinking anymore, and I avoid the woods like the plague, especially at night. The few times I've driven past the forest's edge after dark, I swear I've caught glimpses of something yellow moving between the trees, watching, waiting. I don't know what happened that night. Was it really some kind of monster, a ghost, or just a horrible drunken mistake? I'll probably never know for sure. But one thing's certain, I'll never forget that terrifying encounter in the dark Bayfield woods. Those black, soulless eyes still haunt my dreams. I've never felt so utterly betrayed and violated in my entire life. The past few months have been a whirlwind of emotions, culminating in a horrifying revelation that has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my very existence. My wife and I have been married for 17 years. She's a psychology professor at the local university, brilliant and driven in her career. But over time, our relationship had grown cold and distant. The passion and intimacy we once shared had faded away, replaced by an emptiness that gnawed at me constantly. I felt lonely and starved for affection, trapped in a loveless marriage but too afraid to leave. In my desperation, I started seeing a sex worker named Gemma. At first it was just about physical release, but over time it became so much more. Gemma was warm, attentive, and seemed to genuinely care about me in a way my wife hadn't in years. We'd spend hours talking, laughing, sharing our hopes and fears. She even started using these little flashcards with loving phrases and compliments, which she'd read to me during our time together. It was silly, but it made me feel truly seen and appreciated. I know it was wrong to be unfaithful, but Gemma filled a void in my life that had been empty for so long. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. The guilt ate at me, but I couldn't bring myself to stop seeing her. She had become my lifeline, the one bright spot in my otherwise gray existence. This went on for months, until yesterday, when my entire world came crashing down around me. I came home from work early and found my wife in her study, surrounded by stacks of papers and recordings. At first I thought nothing of it. She was always working on research projects. But then I caught a glimpse of a familiar name on one of the papers, Gemma. My blood ran cold as I scanned the documents, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. Pages and pages of meticulous notes, detailing every interaction I'd had with Gemma, transcripts of our conversations, analyses of my behavioral patterns and emotional responses. It was all there in black and white, every intimate moment, every vulnerable confession, cataloged and dissected like I was some lab rat. When I confronted my wife, her cold clinical response chilled me to my core. She explained with disturbing detachment that it had all been an elaborate psychological experiment. She had orchestrated the entire scenario, hiring Gemma, feeding her information about me, even providing those damned flashcards, all to study male psychology and emotional dependency. Every aspect of my relationship with Gemma had been carefully controlled and monitored. My wife had manipulated my entire emotional life for months, all in the name of her research. She spoke about it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world to systematically deconstruct your husband's psyche. I felt sick to my stomach as the full weight of the betrayal hit me. Not only had my wife been cold and distant for years, she had actively exploited my loneliness and pain for her own academic pursuits. She had violated my trust in the most profound way possible, reducing our entire marriage to nothing more than fodder for her twisted experiments. The confrontation that followed was brutal. I raged and wept, demanding to know how she could do this to me, to us. But she remained maddeningly calm, speaking in the detached tones of a scientist discussing test results. She seemed utterly disconnected from the emotional devastation she had wrought, more concerned with her data than the shattered remnants of our relationship. I stormed out of the house, my mind reeling. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to process the enormity of what had happened. Every memory, every moment I'd shared with Gemma was now tainted. The one relationship that had brought me joy and comfort in recent months had been nothing but an illusion, a carefully crafted lie. As night fell, I found myself parked by the river, staring out at the dark water. The weight of humiliation and betrayal pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I felt utterly alone, adrift in a world I no longer recognized or understood. How could I ever trust anyone again after this? How could I move forward knowing that the person I'd built my life with was capable of such calculated cruelty? I'm writing this now from a cheap motel room, still unable to face going home. I don't know what I'm going to do next. The foundation of my life has been shattered, leaving me lost and reeling. Part of me wants to confront my wife again, to demand answers and accountability. But another part just wants to run, to get as far away from her in this nightmare as possible. The worst part is the lingering doubt, the nagging voice in the back of my mind, wondering if there was ever any real love between us at all. Was our entire marriage just some extended psychological study? How much of my life has been manipulated without my knowledge? I feel like a fool, like my entire existence has been reduced to nothing more than data points in someone else's research. The depth of violation is almost impossible to comprehend. How do you rebuild your life when the person you trusted most has systematically dismantled your very sense of self? I don't know what the future holds, but I know nothing will ever be the same after this. The scars of this betrayal run deep, and I'm not sure they'll ever fully heal. All I can do now is try to pick up the pieces and somehow find a way forward, even as my past crumbles to dust behind me. If there's any lesson to be learned from this nightmare, it's to never take love and trust for granted. The capacity for human cruelty, even from those closest to us, is truly terrifying. I only hope that by sharing my story, I can help others avoid the pain and devastation I've endured. Trust your instincts, value genuine connections, and never let anyone reduce you to an experiment or a statistic. We are all so much more than that. As I sit here in this dingy room, staring at my reflection in the grimy mirror, I hardly recognize the broken man looking back at me. But I have to believe that somewhere, beneath the pain and betrayal, my true self still exists. I have to find a way to reclaim my dignity and rebuild my life on my own terms. It won't be easy, but it's the only way forward. One day at a time, one small step at a time, I'll find my way back to solid ground. I have to believe that, or else what's left? That night, a fierce blizzard was raging outside. The wind howled and snow pelted against the windows. Luke and I were curled up by the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and each other's company. It was around 9 p.m. when we first noticed something wasn't right. There was a frantic scratching sound coming from the front door. At first we thought it was just the wind, but it became more insistent. Luke got up to check, thinking maybe a stray animal was seeking shelter from the storm. When he opened the door, we were shocked to see a fox dart inside, practically climbing over Luke's feet in its desperation to get in. The poor thing was trembling violently, its fur caked with ice and snow. But what struck me most were its eyes. They were wide with absolute terror. Luke and I exchanged worried glances. What could have spooked it so badly? We tried to calm the fox, offering it some water and leftover chicken from dinner. But it remained agitated, pacing and whimpering. That's when we heard more scratching and whining from outside. Luke opened the door again, and 2 raccoons scrambled inside, followed by a couple of rabbits. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't normal behavior, even in a bad storm. These animals should have been hiding in their dens, not seeking shelter with humans. And they all had that same look of raw fear in their eyes. Over the next hour, more and more animals kept showing up. Squirrels, chipmunks, even a few birds that should have migrated south weeks ago. Our living room was turning into a miniature zoo. The strangest part was how these natural predators and prey huddled together, all equally terrified of whatever was out there. Luke and I were starting to get seriously freaked out. We tried calling animal control, but the storm had knocked out the phone lines. We were completely cut off. Around midnight, we heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin. Luke grabbed a flashlight and we cautiously peeked out the window. What we saw made my blood run cold. A massive black bear was staggering through the snow towards our front porch. But this wasn't a normal bear. Its fur was matted with blood, and it was moving erratically, as if gravely injured. As it got closer, I could see deep gashes across its body, like something had tried to tear it apart. The bear collapsed on our porch with a pitiful groan. Luke, always the brave one, decided to go check on it. I begged him not to, but he insisted we couldn't just let it suffer. He grabbed his hunting rifle just in case and slowly opened the door. As soon as Luke stepped outside, all the animals in our living room went berserk. They started shrieking and howling, trying desperately to hide under furniture or climb the walls. I'd never heard such terrified sounds from animals before. Luke approached the bear cautiously. It was barely breathing, its eyes glazed over with pain. As Luke got closer to examine its wounds, the bear suddenly lifted its head and let out a bone-chilling roar. But it wasn't directed at Luke. It was looking at something behind him, in the woods. I'll never forget the look of sheer horror that came over Luke's face as he turned to see what the bear was looking at. He stumbled backwards, dropping the rifle in the snow. "Get inside," he yelled at me. "Lock the door." I did as he said, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. Luke burst in seconds later, slamming the door shut and barricading it with a chair. He was as white as a sheet, gasping for breath. "What is it?" I asked, terrified. "What did you see?" But Luke couldn't speak. He just shook his head, eyes wide with fear. That's when we heard it. A soft, almost childlike voice calling from somewhere in the swirling snow. "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm lost. Can someone help me?" It sounded so innocent, so helpless. But every animal in our cabin went absolutely still, not making a sound. Even the dying bear on our porch had fallen silent. "Don't answer it," Luke whispered hoarsely. "Whatever you do, don't let it know we're here." We huddled together in silence as the voice called out again and again, sounding closer each time. Sometimes it was a child, sometimes an old woman, sometimes even mimicking my own voice or Luke's, but always with that same plaintive request for help. This went on for hours, that thing circling our cabin, calling out in different voices. We could hear heavy footsteps in the snow, branches snapping. Sometimes there would be a long silence, and we'd think maybe it had gone away. But then the voice would start up again, right outside a window or near the chimney. I don't know how long we sat there, frozen in terror. It felt like days. The animals remained unnaturally still and quiet. Even the bear's labored breathing had stopped. I think it died there on our porch sometime during the night. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the voice and footsteps finally faded away. The blizzard died down to gentle snowfall. Slowly, cautiously, the animals in our cabin began to stir. One by one, they made their way to the door. Luke opened it, and they fled back into the woods without a backwards glance. I thought the nightmare was over. But as I turned to Luke, ready to collapse into his arms with relief, I saw him clutch his head and crumple to the floor. I called 911 in a panic. When the ambulance finally got through the snow-covered roads, they told me Luke had suffered a massive stroke. He was alive, but barely. The doctors couldn't explain it. Luke was young and in perfect health. There was no reason for this to happen. That was 5 years ago. Luke survived, but he's never been the same. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. I've been his caretaker ever since, watching the strong, vibrant man I married fade away day by day. The worst part is not knowing what really happened that night. What did Luke see out there in the storm? What was that thing circling our cabin, calling out to us? I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find any similar stories or explanations, but I've come up empty every time. Sometimes, on dark winter nights when the wind is howling, I swear I can still hear that voice calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm lost." And I wonder if whatever it was is still out there in the woods, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened to us, but I do know that something evil came to our little cabin in Vermont that night, something that defies explanation. And while it didn't take our lives, it stole our future and left us with nothing but fear and unanswered questions. If you're ever in the woods on a snowy night and hear a voice calling for help, please, I beg you, don't answer. Don't let it know you're there. You might not be as lucky as we were. My cousin Cody and I had been planning this trip for weeks. We're both in our early 20s and love the outdoors, so we figured a weekend of camping would be the perfect way to unwind from our stressful jobs. Cody found this secluded spot deep in Yorapahu that looked beautiful in the pictures. Tall pines, a babbling creek nearby, and supposedly great hiking trails. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon. The drive out there was longer than expected. The forest road seemed to go on forever, getting narrower and rougher the deeper we went. By the time we finally found the little clearing for our campsite, the sun was already starting to set behind the trees. We quickly set up our 2 small tents and got a campfire going as darkness fell. Sitting around the crackling flames, roasting hot dogs and sharing a few beers, everything felt perfect. The night air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of crickets and an owl hooting in the distance. Cody and I swapped stories and jokes late into the night until we were both yawning and decided to turn in. I nestled into my sleeping bag, feeling content and relaxed. The pleasant buzz from the beer lulled me towards sleep. But just as I was drifting off, a sharp crack jolted me awake. It sounded like a branch snapping underfoot, way too close to my tent. I held my breath and listened intently. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the leaf litter, slowly circling our campsite. My heart started racing. I wanted to call out to Cody, but my voice was frozen in my throat. The footsteps continued their slow, methodical circuit. Occasionally they would pause, as if whatever was out there was stopping to listen or look around. I lay there paralyzed, straining my ears to track the movement. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away into the forest. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably just a deer or something, I told myself. No need to freak out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those footsteps sounded distinctly human. I must have eventually fallen into an uneasy sleep, because the next thing I knew, birdsong was filtering through my tent as dawn broke. I unzipped the flap and poked my head out, blinking in the pale morning light. Everything looked normal, no signs of disturbance around our campsite. Cody emerged from his tent a few minutes later, yawning and stretching. "Sleep okay?" he asked. I hesitated, then decided not to mention the footsteps. No need to spook him over what was probably nothing. "Yeah, not bad," I lied. "Ready for some breakfast?" We spent the morning hiking a nearby trail, and I started to relax and enjoy myself again. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, sunlight streaming through the canopy, wildflowers dotting the path. By the time we returned to camp for lunch, I had almost forgotten about the unsettling experience from the night before. As evening approached, we got another fire going and settled in for dinner. The flames cast flickering shadows across the clearing as darkness fell once again. Cody and I were in the middle of debating our plans for the next day when a long, low whistle drifted through the trees. We both froze mid-sentence. The whistle came again, 2 ascending notes, almost like someone calling a dog. But there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Did you hear that?" Cody whispered. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Maybe it's just another camper," I suggested weakly. Cody shook his head. "We're miles from the nearest campground. There shouldn't be anyone else out here." We fell silent, listening intently. The whistle didn't come again, but now that we were paying attention, other sounds began to filter through the usual nighttime forest noises. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and once a sound almost like a laugh, but distorted and guttural. "I don't like this," Cody muttered. "Maybe we should pack up and leave." Part of me wanted to agree, but the rational side of my brain pushed back. "It's pitch black out there," I pointed out. "We'd never find our way back to the car. Let's just keep the fire going and stay alert. We can head out first thing in the morning." Cody reluctantly agreed. We tried to resume our conversation, but neither of us could focus. Every snapping twig made us flinch. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement in the darkness beyond our firelight. That's when I saw it, a pale oval floating among the trees, about head height. It was only visible for a split second before vanishing, but in that moment I could have sworn it was a face, staring right at me with dark, sunken eyes. I let out a strangled gasp. Cody whipped around to look where I was pointing, but whatever I'd seen was already gone. What? What is it?" he demanded. I thought I saw someone watching us," I stammered. "A face just for a second." Cody grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the woods, but the beam revealed nothing but trees and shadows. We were both on edge now, huddled close to the fire and jumping at every sound. Suddenly, something came hurtling out of the darkness and landed with a thud right next to our chairs. Cody yelped and I nearly fell over backwards. Heart pounding, I directed the flashlight beam towards the object. It was a branch, about 2 feet long and as thick as my wrist, deliberately snapped off and thrown into our camp. "Okay, that's it," Cody said, his voice shaking. "We're getting out of here, now." I couldn't argue this time. We hastily doused the fire and grabbed only the essentials, our phones, wallets, and car keys. Everything else could stay behind. Fumbling with our flashlights, we started down the overgrown path that led back to where we'd parked. The forest seemed alive around us as we stumbled through the darkness. Branches clawed at our clothes. Unseen things skittered through the underbrush. And always, that feeling of being watched, of something keeping pace with us, just out of sight. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, we finally reached the car. We practically dove inside, locking the doors and sitting there panting for a moment. As Cody fumbled with the keys, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My blood ran cold. There, illuminated in the red glow of the taillights, was a figure standing in the middle of the road behind us. Tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long. Its face was lost in shadow, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. "Go, go, go!" I shouted. Cody gunned the engine and we peeled out, tires spitting gravel. I twisted around in my seat, heart hammering, but there was nothing visible in the receding taillights. Just empty road swallowed by darkness. We drove in tense silence for a long time, both too keyed up to speak. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that I felt like I could breathe again. We stopped at the first all-night diner we found, downing cup after cup of coffee as our nerves slowly settled. "What the hell was that back there?" Cody finally asked, his voice still unsteady. I shook my head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. Let's just agree to never go camping again, okay?" Cody nodded emphatically. "Deal. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about that night, about pale faces watching from the trees and lanky figures chasing us through endless dark woods. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe some locals were messing with us, or we just let our imaginations run wild. But deep down, I know that doesn't explain everything we experienced. I don't know what was out there in Yorapahu forest, but I do know that I'm never setting foot in those woods again. Some places are better left alone, and some mysteries are better left unsolved." I packed up my car and headed out with my loyal German Shepherd, Midnight. The drive from Portland took about 3 hours. As we got closer to our destination, the roads became increasingly narrow and winding. A light snow had started to fall, dusting the towering pines that flanked the road. By the time we pulled up to the cabin, there was a good inch of fresh powder on the ground. The cabin itself was pretty basic, just one main room with a small kitchen area, a fireplace, and a loft bedroom upstairs. But it had a nice big porch overlooking the woods, which is where I planned to spend most of my time. I unloaded the car, got a fire going in the fireplace, and settled in for what I hoped would be a peaceful evening. As night fell, the snowfall picked up. I was sitting on the couch reading when Midnight suddenly perked up his ears and started growling softly. I looked over at him and saw the fur on his back standing straight up. "What is it, boy?" I asked, peering out the window. But I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the porch. Midnight wouldn't settle down, though. He kept pacing back and forth between the window and the front door, whining anxiously. I tried to calm him, but he was clearly agitated by something. That's when I noticed how unnaturally quiet it had gotten outside. The wind had died down completely, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. I was starting to feel pretty uneasy myself at this point. I double-checked that the door was locked and drew the curtains closed. But as soon as I sat back down, I heard a loud thump from the roof, like something heavy had landed on it. Midnight started barking frantically. My heart was racing as I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the front door. I swept the beam across the porch, illuminating the fresh blanket of snow. And that's when I saw them. A set of huge, inhuman footprints leading right up to the porch steps. They were easily twice the size of my own feet, with long, claw-like toes. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. What the hell could have made prints like that? A bear, maybe? But bears should be hibernating this time of year, and those prints looked nothing like any bear tracks I'd ever seen. For the next hour, I sat tensely on the couch with Midnight, straining to hear any sounds from outside. Occasionally there would be creaks and scratches from the roof, like something was moving around up there. Midnight never stopped growling softly the entire time. Around midnight, things quieted down again. I was exhausted but way too on edge to sleep. I decided to try to distract myself by going through some old photos of my dad that I'd brought along. As I flipped through them, I came across one from our last camping trip together. My dad was pointing at something off in the distance, a concerned look on his face. I'd never really paid attention to that photo before, but now something about it sent a chill down my spine. I was jolted out of my thoughts by the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch. Midnight started barking wildly, hackles raised. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood frozen, staring at the door. The footsteps stopped right in front of it. Then the doorknob slowly started to turn. Thank God I had remembered to lock it. When the door didn't open, whatever was out there began to scratch at it intensely. The sound of claws raking across wood filled the cabin. I backed away, holding the poker out in front of me. "Go away!" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. To my shock, the scratching immediately stopped. For a few seconds there was total silence. Then a deep, guttural growl came from just outside the door. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, but definitely not human either. I don't know how long I stood there, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. Eventually I heard the footsteps moving away from the door and off the porch. I rushed to the window and cautiously peeked out. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. About 50 feet from the cabin, standing at the edge of the woods, was a tall, impossibly thin figure. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with long, gangly limbs. Its skin was a sickly pale color that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. But the worst part was its face, or rather, its lack of a face. Where features should have been, there was just smooth, featureless skin. As I stared in horror, it slowly turned its head towards me. Even with no eyes, I could feel it looking right at me. A sense of malevolent intelligence radiated from it. This thing was evil, and it wanted inside the cabin. I stumbled backwards, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the couch. Midnight huddled against me, whimpering. I sat there for hours, too terrified to move, listening intently for any sounds of the creature returning. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, weak sunlight was streaming through the windows. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw the deep scratches gouged into the front door, and the giant footprints still visible in the snow outside. I packed up my stuff in record time and got the hell out of there. As I was pulling away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a tall, pale figure standing motionless among the trees, watching me leave. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was just my grief and imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that faceless creature trying to get into the cabin. The weirdest part is what I realized later about that old photo of my dad. I went back and looked at it closely, and in the background, barely visible among the trees, there's a faint outline of something tall and thin. It sends chills down my spine to think that my dad might have encountered that same entity years ago. I don't know what that thing was, or why it was so intent on getting to me. but I'm grateful that I listened to that little voice inside, my dad's voice, telling me not to open that door no matter what. I think it may have saved my life that night. I'll never go back to those woods again, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that creature is still waiting. We messaged back and forth with Melvin for a bit, and he seemed friendly enough. We agreed to meet up that evening at a coffee shop downtown to make the exchange. Martina and I were pretty excited as we drove there. We'd been saving up for new phones for months, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. When we got to the coffee shop, though, Melvin was nowhere to be seen. We waited around for about 15 minutes before getting a text from him saying he got held up at work and asking if we could meet at a different location instead. He suggested a park about 10 minutes away. I'll admit, alarm bells started going off in my head at that point. Meeting a stranger from the internet at night in a park didn't exactly seem safe. But Martina was eager to get the phone and convinced me it would probably be fine. "There'll be other people around," she said, "and we'll stay in well-lit areas." So against my better judgment, we drove over to the park. But when we got there, the parking lot was completely empty and most of the lights were out. It was pitch black, except for a few dim lamps along the walking path. My stomach dropped. This did not feel right at all. I turned to Martina and said we should just leave, but before we could, my phone lit up with an incoming call from Melvin. I hesitated, then answered and put it on speaker. "Hey, we're here at the park, but it seems pretty deserted," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we should reschedule for another time?" There was a long pause. Then Melvin's voice came through, low and gravelly. "No, I'm already on my way. Just wait there and I'll be there in 5 minutes." Something about his tone sent chills down my spine. I quickly said we had to go and hung up, my hands shaking. "Let's get out of here now," I said to Martina. She nodded, looking scared. We peeled out of the parking lot and I breathed a sigh of relief as we got back on the main road. But our relief was short-lived. Within minutes, Melvin started blowing up both our phones with calls and angry texts demanding to know where we went. "What do we do?" Martina asked, her voice trembling. "Just ignore him," I said. "We'll block his number when we get home." We drove in tense silence for a while, both of us jumping every time our phones buzzed. After about 20 minutes with no new messages, we started to relax a bit. "Want to grab some food?" Martina asked. "I'm starving after all that stress." I agreed, and we pulled into a 24-hour diner just off the highway. The familiar fluorescent lighting and smell of coffee was comforting after our unsettling experience at the park. We slid into a booth and ordered some food, trying to laugh off our earlier paranoia. But as we were waiting for our meals, I noticed a man sitting alone at the counter, hunched over his phone. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar. I was straining to get a better look at him when he suddenly spoke to the waitress. My blood ran cold. It was the same gravelly voice I'd heard on the phone earlier. Melvin was here in the diner. I grabbed Martina's arm. "We need to leave. Now," I whispered urgently. She looked confused but must have seen the fear in my eyes because she nodded and started gathering her things. We tried to casually make our way to the exit, my heart pounding. But just as we reached the door, I heard Melvin's voice call out behind us. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" We bolted out the door and ran to my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. "Hurry!" Martina cried as we saw Melvin emerge from the diner. I finally got the car started and peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing. In the rearview mirror, I saw Melvin run to a dark SUV parked nearby. "Oh God, he's following us," Martina said, craning her neck to look behind us. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, weaving through traffic. But no matter how fast I went, the headlights of Melvin's SUV stayed right on our tail. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should we go to the police station? Try to lose him on back roads? Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the car lurched violently to one side. "What was that?" Martina screamed. "I think we blew a tire," I said, struggling to keep control of the car. I managed to pull over onto the shoulder, my hands shaking on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I saw Melvin's SUV slow down and pull up behind us. "Lock the doors," I said to Martina, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat there frozen as Melvin got out of his car and slowly approached ours, something glinting in his hand. Just as he reached my door, there was a flash of red and blue lights. A police cruiser had pulled up behind Melvin's SUV. Melvin hesitated for a moment, then turned and sprinted back to his car. He peeled away, tires squealing. The police officer came up to check on us. As I rolled down the window, weak with relief, he shone his flashlight on our flat tire. "Looks like your tire's been slashed," he said. "Good thing I came along when I did. You girls okay?" We nodded, still too shaken to speak. As the officer helped us change the tire, the full reality of what had just happened started to sink in. If that cop hadn't shown up when he did, I didn't even want to think about what might have happened. It turns out Melvin was a known scammer in the area who used online marketplace listings to lure victims to isolated locations. The cops had been trying to catch him for months. Martina and I were lucky to get away relatively unscathed, but I still have nightmares about that gravelly voice and those headlights in my rearview mirror. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe buying anything online again. So let this be a warning. If a deal seems too good to be true, it probably is. And always, always trust your instincts. That uneasy feeling in your gut might just save your life someday. I never thought a school reunion could be so terrifying. It all started when I got a Facebook message from Phoebe, an old classmate I barely remembered from high school. She said there was going to be a 10-year reunion for our class and asked if I wanted to come. I was a bit surprised since I hadn't heard anything about it, but I figured why not? It might be fun to catch up with some old friends. The night of the reunion, I drove to the address Phoebe had given me. It was some old community center I'd never been to before, kind of in a run-down part of town. As soon as I walked in, something felt off. The decorations looked cheap and hastily put up. Just a few balloons and a banner that said, "Welcome Class of 2013," in what looked like marker. I scanned the room, looking for familiar faces, but I didn't recognize anyone at first. Then I spotted Phoebe across the room and went over to say hi. As I got closer, I realized she looked different, older than I expected, with deep lines around her eyes and gray streaks in her hair. I mean, we were only 28, but she looked like she could be in her 40s. "Hey Phoebe, thanks for inviting me," I said, trying to keep things friendly despite my growing unease. She turned and gave me a strange, almost vacant smile. "Of course, we're so glad you could make it. Everyone's been waiting for you." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced around the room again. And now that I was looking more closely, I realized all the classmates looked way older than they should. Some of them even looked elderly. Before I could process what was happening, people started coming up to me, asking really personal questions. "How's your mother doing? Is she still sick?" one woman asked, even though I'd never mentioned anything about my mom's health to anyone from high school. Another guy wanted to know about my job, reciting details about my company that I'd never shared publicly. I tried to laugh it off, make some excuse about needing to use the restroom, but every time I tried to move away, someone else would step in front of me. Their eyes never left my face, staring intently like they were trying to memorize every feature. The room started to feel smaller, closing in around me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a hand grabbed my arm. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 60s, looking at me with clear panic in his eyes. "You need to leave," he whispered urgently. "Now, while you still can." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, ignoring the calls of "wait" and "don't go yet" behind me. As I burst out into the cool night air, I heard footsteps following me. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock it. Just as I got the door open, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, ready to fight if I had to, but it was the same older man who'd warned me inside. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "That wasn't a real reunion. None of those people went to your school. They're something else. I don't know what exactly, but they're dangerous. They've been planning this for months, waiting for you." "What? Why me?" I asked, my mind reeling. "I don't know," he replied, "but you need to go home, pack a bag, and get out of town. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and whatever you do, don't trust anyone named Phoebe." With that cryptic warning, he disappeared into the shadows. I got in my car and peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing. As I drove home, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who were those people? What did they want with me? When I got home, I immediately started researching. I looked up our actual class reunion. It wasn't for another 6 months. Then I searched for Phoebe on social media, but I couldn't find any trace of her. It was like she'd never existed. On a hunch, I searched for Claire Foster, a name I'd overheard someone call Phoebe at the fake reunion. What I found made my blood run cold. There was an old news article about a Claire Foster who'd gone missing 20 years ago, last seen at her high school reunion. The photo showed a woman who looked eerily similar to the Phoebe I'd met that night. I don't know what's going on, but I'm terrified. I've packed a bag, and I'm leaving town tonight. I don't know where I'm going or when I'll be back. If anyone else gets an invitation to a reunion from someone you barely remember, please, for your own safety, don't go. I have a feeling I only narrowly escaped something truly horrifying, and I can't shake the sense that this isn't over. They're still out there, waiting, planning, and for some reason, they want me. I keep replaying that night in my head, trying to make sense of it all. The way everyone stared at me, like they were studying me. The invasive questions, the information they shouldn't have known, and that warning from the old man. Who was he? How did he know what was going on? The more I think about it, the more unsettling details I remember, like how the room felt slightly too warm, almost stuffy, even though it was a cool night outside, or the faint, sweet smell that seemed to permeate the air, something floral, but with an underlying chemical tang that made me feel slightly dizzy. And the silence. Despite all the people in the room, there was no background chatter, no music playing. Just an eerie quiet broken only when someone spoke directly to me. I can't stop thinking about their eyes, too. They all had this intense, almost hungry look, like they were trying to devour me with their gaze. And when I think back, I realize their pupils were slightly too large, even in the bright fluorescent lighting of the community center. What haunts me most, though, is the moment right before I left. As I was running for the door, I glanced back and saw Phoebe, or Claire, or whoever she really was, standing perfectly still in the center of the room. Everyone else had turned to watch me go, but she remained facing away. And just as I pushed through the door, she started to turn her head. Slowly, impossibly slowly, like a mechanical doll. I didn't stay to see her face, but the unnatural movement of it has been featuring in my nightmares ever since. I've been driving for hours now, putting as much distance between myself and that town as I can, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being followed. Every time I check my rearview mirror, I expect to see a car full of those strange, too old classmates right behind me. I don't know what they wanted from me, or why they went to such elaborate lengths to set up this fake reunion. But the fact that they had so much personal information about me, things I've never shared online or with anyone from high school, makes me think this goes deeper than just one night. How long have they been watching me? What else do they know? And most importantly, what would have happened if I'd stayed at that reunion any longer? I'm writing this from a motel room somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I've been too scared to sleep, jumping at every little sound. I keep expecting to hear a knock at the door, to see Phoebe's face peering in through the window. If anyone else has experienced anything like this, please reach out. I need to know I'm not going crazy. And if you haven't, be careful. They're out there, whoever or whatever they are, and they're looking for something, or someone. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I know I can't go back to my old life. Not until I figure out what's going on and why I was targeted. All I know is that night at the fake reunion was just the beginning of something much bigger and much more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. Stay safe, everyone. And if you get an invitation to a reunion you don't remember, for the love of God, don't go. I remember waking up to the sound of my parents' voices in the hallway. It was the middle of the night, pitch black outside. I could hear the urgency in their hushed tones as they spoke in quick, clipped sentences. "We have to go now. Chris needs us." I know. Let me just grab my keys." "Should we wake him up?" "No, let him sleep. We'll be back before morning." I heard the jingle of keys, footsteps hurrying down the stairs, and then the front door closing. The house fell silent. I lay there in the darkness, my heart racing. Chris was my older brother. He'd moved out a few months ago to start college. What could have happened that my parents had to rush out in the middle of the night? I wanted to call out, to ask what was going on, but something held me back. Maybe it was the seriousness in their voices, or just the eerie stillness of the house. I pulled my blanket up tighter and tried to go back to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the old house settling made me jump. The shadows in my room seemed to shift and move. I kept imagining terrible things happening to Chris. Was he hurt? In the hospital? My mind conjured up increasingly scary scenarios. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I decided I needed a glass of water. Maybe that would help calm my nerves. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. I tiptoed down the hallway, not wanting to make any noise in the empty house. As I passed my parents' room, I noticed their door was slightly ajar. That was odd. They always closed it at night. A floorboard creaked under my foot, and I froze, holding my breath. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft shuffling sound, coming from inside my parents' room. My heart began to pound. That couldn't be my parents. I'd heard them leave. Chris was away at college. We didn't have any pets. So what was making that noise? I stood there paralyzed, straining my ears. The shuffling stopped, then started again. It sounded like footsteps, muffled on the carpet. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to my room, to hide under the covers. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. Suddenly, a shadow passed in front of the crack in the doorway. Just for an instant, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in there. Terror gripped me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled backwards, bumping into the wall. The thud seemed deafening in the quiet house. The shuffling inside the room stopped abruptly. I heard a sharp intake of breath that wasn't my own. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, sprinting back to my room as fast as my legs could carry me. I dove under the covers, shaking uncontrollably. I lay there for what felt like hours, ears straining for any sound. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my window. For a blissful moment, I thought it had all been a bad dream. Then the memories came rushing back, and my stomach clenched with fear. I crept out of my room, peering nervously down the hallway. Everything looked normal in the cheerful morning light. My parents' door was closed now. I made my way downstairs on shaky legs. To my immense relief, I found my mom in the kitchen making breakfast. "Good morning, sweetie," she said with a tired smile. "Sorry we had to run out last night. Your brother had a bit of an accident, but he's okay now." I nodded mutely, not trusting myself to speak. Should I tell her what happened? Would she even believe me? As I sat down at the table, I noticed something odd. There was a dirty footprint on the kitchen floor, much larger than my own foot. It looked like it had been made by a wet, muddy shoe. My mom followed my gaze, her brow furrowed. "That's strange," she muttered. "I just mopped yesterday." A chill ran down my spine. I knew then that it hadn't been a dream. Someone had been in our house last night while I was alone. I opened my mouth, ready to spill everything. But at that moment, my dad walked in looking exhausted. "Morning, champ," he said, ruffling my hair as he passed. "Chris says hi. He's feeling much better now." The conversation turned to my brother and his late-night misadventure. The moment to share my terrifying experience had passed. Part of me was relieved. Maybe it was better not to say anything. Maybe I had imagined it all, my mind playing tricks in the dark. But as the days went by, little things kept nagging at me. A window left slightly open that we always kept locked. Some cash missing from my dad's wallet. My mom's favorite necklace disappeared without explanation. I never told anyone what happened that night. Even now, decades later, I'm not sure they would believe me. But I know what I saw and heard. Someone was in our house that night. Someone who didn't belong. And to this day, I have no idea who it was or what they wanted. The thought still makes me shudder. Because whoever it was, they were just feet away from my bedroom as I lay there, young and vulnerable. What might have happened if I hadn't run when I did? It's a question that haunts me to this day. And it's why, even as an adult, I always triple-check the locks before going to bed. Because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows when you're alone in the dark. Martha was a sweet 65-year-old woman who had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. Her family hired me to provide overnight care, as Martha had been having trouble sleeping and would often wander around the house at night. They warned me that she could get a bit confused sometimes. but assured me it was nothing serious. The first few nights went smoothly enough. Martha would usually wake up once or twice, and I'd gently guide her back to bed. She was always polite and cooperative, even if she seemed a bit disoriented. I started to think this would be an easy assignment, but on that fourth night, everything changed. I was dozing lightly in the guest room when I heard a loud crash from downstairs. I bolted awake, my heart racing. As I listened intently, I could hear cabinets slamming and drawers being yanked open. "Martha," I called out tentatively as I made my way down the stairs. "Is everything okay?" There was no response, just more banging and clattering. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze in shock. The kitchen was a disaster. Pots and pans strewn across the floor, food dumped out of the fridge, drawers pulled out of their tracks. And there in the middle of it all stood Martha, wild-eyed and disheveled, clutching a massive chef's knife. "Martha, honey, why don't you put that down?" I said, in what I hoped was a soothing tone, trying to hide how terrified I felt. "Let's get you back to bed." She whirled to face me, brandishing the knife. "Who are you?" she shrieked. "What are you doing in my house?" I held up my hands placatingly. "It's me, Annie, your caregiver, remember? I'm here to help you." But there was no recognition in her eyes, only fear and rage. She lunged at me suddenly, slashing wildly with the knife. I leapt back, barely avoiding the blade. "Get out!" she screamed. "Thief! Murderer!" I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't the sweet, confused Martha I knew. Something had snapped inside her, turning her into something else entirely. As she advanced on me, still swinging the knife, I realized with growing horror that she truly didn't know who I was. In her mind, I was an intruder she needed to defend herself against. I turned and ran for the front door, fumbling with the locks as Martha's uneven footsteps drew closer. Just as I got the door open, I felt a searing pain across my back. The knife had grazed me as Martha took another swing. Ignoring the pain, I sprinted out into the night. I could hear Martha behind me, still shouting incoherently. I ran down the street in my pajamas, not daring to look back. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer terror kept me going. I made it several blocks before I finally slowed, gasping for air. When I glanced over my shoulder, there was no sign of Martha. I collapsed onto someone's front lawn, shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to wear off. As I sat there trying to catch my breath, the full weight of what had just happened hit me. Sweet old Martha, who baked cookies and loved to show me pictures of her grandkids, had just tried to kill me. The Martha I knew was gone, replaced by a violent stranger who saw me as a threat. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I managed to pull myself together enough to call the police. They found Martha wandering aimlessly a few blocks from her house, still clutching the knife, but seemingly unaware of what had happened. The cut on my back wasn't deep, thankfully, but I still needed a few stitches. The physical wound healed quickly, but the emotional scars have been slower to fade. I haven't been able to go back to caregiving since that night. The trauma is still too raw. Sometimes I lie awake at night, remembering the crazed look in Martha's eyes as she came at me with that knife. I know it wasn't really her fault. The dementia had taken over, warping her mind. But that almost makes it worse, knowing that this sweet woman I cared for could transform into such a dangerous stranger in an instant. I still don't understand how it happened so suddenly. Martha had been confused before, but never violent. It was like a switch flipped in her brain, turning her into someone else entirely. The doctors say it can happen sometimes with dementia patients, these episodes of extreme aggression and paranoia. But knowing that doesn't make it any less terrifying. The hardest part is knowing that Martha probably has no memory of what happened that night. To her, it was just another confused blur. But for me, those terrifying moments are seared into my brain forever. I still have nightmares about being chased through that house, hearing Martha's guttural screams behind me. I've tried to move on, to put that night behind me, but I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the look of pure hatred in Martha's eyes as she tried to kill me, or the sickening realization that the sweet woman I knew was gone, replaced by a violent stranger. It's been months now, and I still jump at unexpected noises. I'm seeing a therapist to work through the trauma, but progress is slow. I know that what happened that night was the result of a cruel disease, not any fault of Martha's. But that rational understanding doesn't stop the nightmares or panic attacks. I've thought about reaching out to Martha's family to see how she's doing now, but I can't bring myself to do it. I'm too afraid of stirring up those memories again. I hope she's getting the care she needs, but I know I can't be the one to provide it anymore. This experience has forever changed how I view dementia and elder care. I used to think of it as just forgetfulness and confusion. Now I understand how truly devastating and dangerous it can be. Martha may have been the one with dementia, but in a way, we both lost ourselves that night. I don't know if I'll ever be able to return to caregiving. The fear is still too raw, too close to the surface. For now, I'm just trying to heal and move forward, one day at a time. But I'll never forget that terrifying night when the sweet woman I cared for became my worst nightmare. To Rob. When I first met him, he seemed nice enough, a bit quiet and awkward but polite. He helped me move my boxes in and even offered to show me around the neighborhood. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found such a considerate roommate. But things started getting weird pretty quickly. I'd catch Rob staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. He'd ask really personal questions about my dating life and work schedule. At first, I brushed it off as social awkwardness, but deep down, something felt off. About a week after I moved in, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I opened my bedroom door, I saw a shadow dart away down the hall. My heart started racing. Was that Rob? Had he been standing outside my door? I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The next morning, I casually mentioned to Rob that I thought I heard something in the night. He got really defensive, insisting he'd been asleep the whole time. His reaction only made me more suspicious. I started noticing other strange things. Some of my clothes seemed slightly out of place, like someone had been going through my closet. My laptop would sometimes be in a different position than where I'd left it. Nothing was ever missing, but it felt like someone had been touching my stuff. I decided to start locking my bedroom door at night. When Rob noticed, he got weirdly upset about it. He kept saying things like, "Don't you trust me? We're roommates. We shouldn't have secrets." It creeped me out how fixated he was on my door being unlocked. Things escalated about a month in. I came home from work one day to find Rob in my room, supposedly looking for a book he'd lent me. But the panicked look on his face told me he was up to something else. I started keeping all my valuables locked in my car, not feeling safe leaving anything in the apartment. I knew I needed to get out of there, but I was stuck in a lease. I started spending as much time as possible out of the apartment, only coming home to sleep. Rob didn't like that at all. He'd text me constantly asking where I was, when I'd be home. It felt like he was trying to keep tabs on me 24/7. One night, I woke up to the sound of my doorknob jiggling. My blood ran cold as I realized someone was trying to get into my room. I called out, "Rob, is that you?" The jiggling stopped immediately, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. I was terrified, but also furious. This had gone too far. The next day I confronted Rob about it. He denied everything, claiming he'd been asleep all night, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. That's when I decided enough was enough. I needed to install a proper lock on my bedroom door. When I told Rob my plans, he completely flipped out. He started yelling about how I was ruining our trust and roommate bond. He even threatened to kick me out if I changed the lock. I was shocked by his reaction, but it only confirmed my suspicions that something was seriously wrong with this guy. Determined to protect myself, I went ahead and bought a new lock anyway. As I was installing it, Rob came home early and caught me in the act. The look on his face was terrifying, a mixture of rage and something else I couldn't quite place. He stormed off to his room, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise had me on edge, convinced Rob was going to try something. I even considered barricading my door with furniture, but I didn't want to seem completely paranoid. The next morning, I decided to do some digging online. What I found chilled me to the bone. There were multiple posts on local forums from women warning others about Rob. They described him as a stalker who had harassed them, stolen their belongings, and even broken into their homes. Some of the stories were horrifyingly similar to what I'd been experiencing. I felt sick to my stomach. How had I ended up living with this predator? I knew I needed to get out immediately, but I was scared of how Rob might react if I told him I was leaving. I called my boss and explained the situation, asking if I could work remotely for a few days. Thankfully, she was understanding. Then I reached out to a friend who lived nearby, asking if I could crash on her couch for a bit. With an escape plan in place, I started quietly packing up my essentials while Rob was at work. Just as I was about to leave, Rob came home unexpectedly. He saw my packed bags and his face contorted with anger. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, blocking the doorway. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I tried to stay calm, telling him I was just going to visit a friend for a few days, but he wasn't buying it. He started ranting about how I couldn't leave him, how we were meant to be together. It was like a switch had flipped, and all his true crazy was coming out. When he grabbed my arm to stop me from leaving, I knew I had to act fast. I managed to break free and run to my room, locking the door behind me. Rob was pounding on the door, screaming for me to come out. I was shaking so badly I could barely dial 911 on my phone. Those minutes waiting for the police to arrive were the longest of my life. I could hear Rob destroying things in the living room, all while yelling threats and professing his twisted version of love for me. I was huddled in the corner of my room, praying he wouldn't break down the door. Finally, I heard sirens approaching. The relief I felt when the police knocked on the apartment door was indescribable. They quickly assessed the situation and arrested Rob, who was still in a rage. As they led him away, he kept looking back at me with this chilling smile, like he knew something I didn't. It made my skin crawl. I gave my statement to the police, showing them the online posts I'd found about Rob's past behavior. They told me I'd done the right thing by calling them. I spent that night at my friend's place, still shaken by everything that had happened. The next day, I went back to the apartment with a police escort to get the rest of my things. The place was a mess from Rob's rampage, but I was just grateful to be getting out of there alive. It's been a few months since then, and I'm still processing everything. I have a new apartment now, with much better security and no roommates. But I still have trouble sleeping some nights. worried I'll wake up to find Rob standing over my bed. I later found out that Rob had been charged with multiple counts of stalking and breaking and entering. Apparently, I wasn't his first victim, but I'm hoping I'll be his last. The whole experience has made me much more cautious about who I trust and live with. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I missed or ignored. I guess I wanted so badly to believe that people are generally good that I overlooked some pretty obvious warning signs. It's a lesson I'll never forget. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others, especially young women living alone or with roommates. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to reach out for help or remove yourself from a dangerous situation. It could save your life. I still don't know what Rob's endgame was, or how far he might have gone if I hadn't gotten out when I did. And honestly, I don't want to know. I'm just grateful to be safe and free from that nightmare. But I'll always wonder, how many other Robs are out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for their next victim? I still get chills thinking about that day, even though it's been over 20 years now. I was only 9 years old at the time, but the memories are seared into my brain like it happened yesterday. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in our small suburban neighborhood. My best friend Dennis and I were riding our bikes up and down the street, enjoying the warm summer day. We'd been best friends since kindergarten and spent pretty much every weekend together, either at his house or mine. As we were pedaling along, a beat-up old station wagon pulled up alongside us. The driver rolled down his window and called out to us, "Hey there, boys. Dennis, your Uncle John sent me to pick you up. He's over at your house and wants you to come home." I glanced at Dennis, confused. I'd never heard him mention an Uncle John before. Dennis looked equally puzzled, but then shrugged. "Oh, okay. I guess I better go then." The man smiled, but something about it made my skin crawl. "Why don't you both hop in and I'll give you a ride? It's awful hot out here." Every instinct in my body was screaming that something wasn't right. That's okay, mister. I think I'll just ride my bike home," I said nervously. "Nonsense," the man insisted. "There's plenty of room. Come on, I don't want to keep your uncle waiting, Dennis." Before I could protest further, Dennis was already walking his bike towards the car. I reluctantly followed, not wanting to leave my friend. The man got out and helped us put our bikes in the back of the station wagon. As I climbed into the back seat, my heart was pounding. "So where exactly are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Oh, just a quick stop at my place first to grab something for Dennis's uncle," the man replied casually. "It's not far." We drove for about 10 minutes, heading away from our neighborhood into an area I didn't recognize. The houses got smaller and more run-down looking. Finally, we pulled up in front of a dilapidated old house with peeling paint and overgrown weeds in the yard. "All right, boys, let's head inside. I just need to grab something real quick," the man said as he got out of the car. Dennis and I exchanged worried glances. This definitely didn't seem right. But before we could say anything, the man had opened the back door and was ushering us out of the car. As we walked up to the front door, I noticed all the windows were covered with heavy curtains or boards. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Everything about this felt wrong. The man unlocked the front door and motioned for us to go inside. I hesitated, but Dennis went in first, so I nervously followed. The interior was dark and musty smelling. Old newspapers and empty beer cans littered the floor. I think I better get home," I said, my voice shaking. My mom will be wondering where I am." The man's friendly demeanor suddenly changed. His face hardened, and he grabbed my arm roughly. "You're not going anywhere, kid. Now both of you get down to the basement." Pure terror coursed through me. This was really happening. We were being kidnapped. Dennis started crying, and I felt like I might throw up. The man shoved us towards a door that I assumed led to the basement. My mind was racing, desperately trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. As he opened the basement door, I caught a glimpse of Dennis's terrified face, and something inside me snapped. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched my arm free and shoved the man as hard as I could. He stumbled backwards, caught off guard. "Run, Dennis!" I screamed. We bolted for the front door, but it was locked. The man was already coming after us. In a panic, I ran into the kitchen and spotted a phone on the wall. With shaking hands, I grabbed it and quickly dialed 911 as Dennis cowered behind me. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. "Please help us," I cried. "A man kidnapped me and my friend. We're at his house and he's trying to take us to the basement." Just then, the man burst into the kitchen. His eyes were wild with rage as he lunged for the phone. I ducked out of the way, still clutching the receiver. "What's your location?" the 911 operator asked urgently. "I don't know the address," I sobbed. "It's an old white house with—" The man ripped the phone from my hands and slammed it down. He grabbed me by the shirt, and I thought for sure he was going to kill me. But just then, we heard the distant wail of police sirens. The man's face went pale. He shoved me away and ran out the back door. Dennis and I huddled together, shaking uncontrollably as we waited for the police to arrive. It felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes before we heard pounding on the front door. "Police! Open up!" I've never been so relieved to see anyone in my life as I was to see those officers. They quickly got us out of the house and called our parents. The next few hours were a blur of police interviews and tearful reunions with our families. It turns out the man was an associate of Dennis's father, who was involved in some shady business dealings. He had planned to use us as leverage to extort money. Thankfully, he was caught a few days later trying to flee the state. To this day, I'm haunted by how differently things could have turned out. If I hadn't managed to call 911, who knows what would have happened to us in that basement. I still have nightmares sometimes about those terrifying moments in that dark, musty house. I know I'm incredibly lucky to have escaped, but the experience left deep emotional scars. For years afterwards, I was paranoid about strangers and had severe anxiety. Even now as an adult, I'm extremely protective of my own kids and get nervous when they're out of my sight. Dennis and I drifted apart after that day. I think we both wanted to forget about what happened, and being around each other just brought back the traumatic memories. Last I heard, he had moved to another state. Sometimes I wonder about that man and what kind of person could do something so evil to innocent children. Was he born that way, or did something in his life turn him into a monster? I'll never understand it. All I know is that I'm grateful every single day that I made it out of that house alive. It was the scariest day of my life, and one I'll never forget as long as I live. I just hope by sharing my story, it might help someone else stay safe and trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right. You never think something like this could happen to you until it does. I still can't shake the events of last New Year's Eve. It's been months, but every time I close my eyes, I see that rocking chair moving on its own. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself there must be some logical explanation, but deep down, I know what I saw was real. It all started when my friend Logan invited a group of us over to his place for a New Year's party. Logan had recently inherited his grandmother's old Victorian house after she passed away, and he was excited to show it off. The house was beautiful, but a bit creepy, all creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. Still, we were in high spirits as we rang in the new year with drinks and laughter. Around 1 a.m., most of the guests had left, and it was just me, Logan, and our friends Jess and Mike. We were sitting in the living room, pleasantly buzzed, when we heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It sounded like a rhythmic creaking, almost like footsteps. "What was that?" Jess asked, her eyes wide. Logan shrugged it off. "Probably just the old pipes settling. This house makes all kinds of weird noises." But the creaking continued, growing louder and more insistent. It definitely didn't sound like pipes to me. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. "Maybe we should check it out," I suggested reluctantly. Part of me didn't want to know, but curiosity was getting the better of me. Logan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, okay. It's probably nothing, but we might as well take a look." The four of us made our way down the narrow basement stairs, the old wood groaning beneath our feet. The creaking sound was clearer now, a steady back-and-forth rhythm. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, Logan fumbled for the light switch. The single bare bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the cluttered basement. And there, in the far corner, we saw it, an old wooden rocking chair, moving steadily back and forth on its own. My blood ran cold. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. But when I opened my eyes again, the chair was still rocking. "What the hell?" Mike whispered, his face pale. Logan had gone completely still beside me. That's my grandma's old rocking chair," he said, his voice shaking. "I forgot it was even down here." We all stood frozen, watching in horror as the chair continued its eerie motion. There was no breeze, no possible explanation for why it would be moving on its own. Jess let out a strangled sob and backed away, nearly tripping on the stairs. "We need to get out of here, now." But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the chair. As I stared, I could have sworn I saw the faintest shimmer of something in the seat, like heat rising off pavement on a hot day. The air felt thick and heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the rocking stopped. The abrupt silence was almost as unnerving as the movement had been. Then, slowly, the chair began to turn towards us. That was enough to snap us all out of our paralysis. We scrambled up the stairs in a panic, tripping over each other in our haste to get away. Logan slammed the basement door behind us, leaning against it and breathing hard. "What the fuck was that?" Mike demanded, his voice cracking. "Tell me there's some kind of explanation for what we just saw." Logan shook his head, looking shell-shocked. I can't explain it. That chair belonged to my grandma. She used to sit in it every day, rocking and knitting, but she's been gone for months now." A chill ran down my spine. "Do you think, could it have been her ghost?" As soon as the words left my mouth, I felt ridiculous. Ghosts weren't real. There had to be a logical explanation. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just witnessed something beyond our understanding. We spent the next hour huddled in the living room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. None of us wanted to leave. Safety in numbers, I guess. But we were all too freaked out to sleep. As the sky began to lighten outside, we finally worked up the courage to check the basement again. Logan insisted on going alone, but we refused to let him. Heart pounding, I followed him down the stairs. The chair was exactly where it had been before, completely motionless. Logan approached it cautiously, running his hand over the worn wood. "It's ice cold," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We searched the entire basement, looking for any possible explanation, strings, hidden mechanisms, anything that could have caused the chair to move. But we found nothing. As the sun rose on the new year, we were left with more questions than answers. In the harsh light of day, it was tempting to dismiss what we'd seen as a shared hallucination, maybe brought on by too much alcohol and the spooky atmosphere of the old house. But deep down, I know what I saw. That chair moved on its own, guided by some force I can't explain. In the months since, I've done research on paranormal activity and spoken to others who've had similar experiences. I'm not sure I believe in ghosts, exactly, but I do believe there are things in this world that defy rational explanation. Logan still lives in that house, but he keeps the basement door locked now. He says he sometimes hears the creaking at night, but he never goes to investigate. I don't blame him. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. As for me, I can't stop thinking about that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see that chair rocking back and forth, back and forth. I wonder if Logan's grandmother was trying to tell us something, or if it was just a random occurrence. I don't have any answers, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never look at a rocking chair the same way again. And part of me will always be waiting, watching for that telltale motion out of the corner of my eye, wondering if I'll ever witness something so inexplicable again. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself more open to the possibility of the supernatural, more willing to listen when others share their own strange encounters. At the same time, I'm more skeptical of easy explanations, always looking for the hidden truth behind the obvious. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed in that basement longer, if we'd tried to communicate with whatever force was moving the chair. Would we have gotten answers, or just more questions? Part of me wishes we'd been braver, but another part is relieved we got out when we did. I've tried to talk to others about what happened, but most people just laugh it off, or try to come up with rational explanations. And maybe they're right. Maybe there is some logical reason for what we saw. But until I find that reason, I'll always remember the night we rang in the new year with a ghost in the basement and the chill that ran through me as I watched that empty chair rock back and forth in the darkness. I arrived at the bar around 9 p.m. It was pretty crowded for a weeknight, with most of the pool tables already taken. I grabbed a beer at the bar and scanned the room, hoping to find an open table. That's when I noticed this guy giving me the eye from across the room. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a bit of stubble. Not bad looking, but something about him made me uneasy. I tried to ignore him and focus on finding a table. But after a few minutes he sauntered over. "Looking for a game?" he asked with a crooked smile. I hesitated, but figured what the hell, I came here to play pool after all. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound casual. We grabbed the first open table and started playing. At first, things seemed normal enough. We made small talk between shots. He said his name was Mike, and he came here pretty often. I purposely kept things vague when he asked about me, not wanting to give away too much personal info. As the night went on, Mike got progressively more drunk and started making me uncomfortable. His friendly touches lingered a bit too long. He kept trying to get me to do shots with him. I politely declined, saying I needed to drive home soon. That's when things took a dark turn. Mike's whole demeanor changed in an instant. His eyes got this cold, predatory look. "Come on, don't be such a tease," he growled. I know you came here looking for a good time. Let's get out of here and have some real fun. I felt my heart start racing. Thanks, but I'm good here, I said firmly. I'm just here to play pool. Mike's face twisted into an angry snarl. He grabbed my arm roughly. Don't be a fucking bitch, he hissed. You've been leading me on all night. I yanked my arm away, feeling a surge of panic. I'm leaving. Don't touch me again, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I quickly gathered my things, planning to get the hell out of there. But as I reached for my purse, Mike snatched it away. Give that back, I yelled, drawing looks from nearby patrons. Mike just sneered and held it out of reach. Maybe I'll hang on to this as collateral. Make sure you don't go running off just yet. I was about to scream for help when the bartender came over. Is there a problem here? He asked, eyeing Mike suspiciously. Mike's demeanor instantly changed. He flashed a charming smile and handed my purse back. No problem at all. Just a little misunderstanding with my girlfriend here. Right, babe? He gave me a pointed look. I was shaking at this point, but managed to grab my purse. I'm not his girlfriend, I told the bartender, and I'm leaving now. I rushed out of the bar as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure Mike wasn't following me. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling as I unlocked my car. I peeled out of the parking lot, watching the rearview mirror the whole time. It wasn't until I got home that I started to calm down a bit. I collapsed onto my couch, my heart still pounding. What the hell just happened? I kept replaying the night in my head, wondering if I had inadvertently done something to provoke Mike. But no, his behavior was completely unacceptable regardless. I decided to dump the contents of my purse out, just to make sure nothing was missing after Mike had grabbed it. That's when I noticed something small and unfamiliar mixed in with my stuff. I picked it up. It was a small round disc about the size of a quarter. With a sinking feeling, I realized what it was, an Apple AirTag. My blood ran cold as the implications hit me. This creep had slipped a tracking device into my purse. He could see my location. He knew where I lived. I immediately disabled the AirTag and destroyed it. But the damage was already done. Mike knew my address now. I spent the rest of the night in a panic, checking all my doors and windows obsessively. Every little noise made me jump. I barely slept that night. The next morning I was a wreck. I kept peeking out my windows, half expecting to see Mike lurking outside. Around noon, I noticed an old Lincoln Continental drive slowly past my house. Something about it immediately set off alarm bells. Over the next few hours, I saw the same car pass by at least 3 more times. My stomach churned with fear. It had to be Mike. He was watching me, stalking me. But why? What did he want? I was terrified to leave my house, but also scared to stay there alone. I called my best friend and tearfully explained the situation. She came over right away to stay with me, which helped calm me down a bit. We spent the day inside, jumping at every sound. The Lincoln drove by 2 more times. I wanted to call the police, but what could I even tell them? I had no proof, just my suspicions. As night fell, my nerves were completely shot. Every shadow seemed menacing. I kept imagining Mike breaking in, attacking us. My friend suggested we leave and stay at her place for the night. I agreed. I couldn't take another night in this house. We quickly packed a bag and headed out to her car. That's when we saw it. The Lincoln was parked down the street, engine idling. As soon as we stepped outside, it started moving towards us. We ran back inside and slammed the door, fumbling with the locks. I was sobbing hysterically at this point. We called 911, but by the time police arrived, the car was long gone. They took a report, but seemed skeptical of my story. They said they'd keep an eye on the area, but I could tell they weren't taking it too seriously. How could I make them understand the terror I was experiencing? It's been 3 days now, and I haven't seen the Lincoln again, but I can't shake this feeling of dread. I jump every time my phone buzzes, terrified it will be Mike somehow. I've barely slept or eaten. I don't know what to do. How long will this go on? Will I ever feel safe again? I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd gone home with Mike that night. The thought makes me sick. I'm writing this all out partly to process it, partly in hopes that someone out there has been through something similar and can offer advice. I feel so alone and scared. I just want my normal life back, but I'm not sure that's possible now. How do you move on when you know someone out there is obsessed with you, watching your every move? I never should have gone to that bar alone. I never should have played pool with a stranger. I've replayed that night over and over, thinking of all the things I could have done differently. But it's too late now. All I can do is try to stay safe and hope this nightmare ends soon. But deep down, I have a sinking feeling that this is only the beginning. It was just another Friday night at the upscale bar where I've been working as a bartender for the past 15 years. The place was packed as usual, with Baltimore's elite sipping on overpriced cocktails and pretending to be more important than they really are. I was in my element, mixing drinks and making small talk with the regulars. At 40 years old, I've seen it all in this job, or so I thought. Around 11 p.m., I noticed a man I'd never seen before sitting alone at the far end of the bar. There was something off about him. He wasn't dressed like our usual clientele, and he had this intense, almost manic energy about him. But hey, as long as he could pay for his drinks, I didn't care. I made my way over to take his order, putting on my best professional smile. "What can I get for you tonight, sir?" He looked up at me, and I swear my blood ran cold. His eyes were filled with such raw hatred and anger, all of it directed straight at me. For a moment, I was frozen in place, unable to look away from that burning glare. Then he spoke, his voice low and menacing. "I know what you did." My mind started racing, trying to figure out what the hell he was talking about. Had I cut him off at some point? Overcharged him? I couldn't place his face at all. Before I could stammer out a response, he barked, "Jägermeister, now." I nodded and quickly poured him a shot, my hands shaking slightly. As I set it down in front of him, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron. "You can't hide from it forever," he growled. "Your time is coming." He let go and downed the shot in one gulp. I backed away, feeling sick to my stomach. What the fuck was going on? The man stood up abruptly and walked out without another word, leaving cash on the bar. I watched him go, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to follow him, to demand answers, but a bigger part was relieved to see him leave. I tried to shake it off and focus on work, but I couldn't get those eyes out of my head. The raw hatred I saw there, it wasn't the look of someone who'd been mildly inconvenienced. This guy wanted me to suffer. By the time my shift ended at 3 a.m., I'd mostly convinced myself I was overreacting. The guy was probably just some drunk weirdo looking to start trouble. Still, I couldn't quite shake the unease as I drove home. I live alone in a small house about 20 minutes from the bar. As I pulled into my driveway, everything looked normal, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached my front door. Something felt wrong. I fumbled with my keys, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. As soon as I got inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. See? Nothing to worry about. Just my imagination running wild after a stressful night. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and headed upstairs, ready to unwind and get some sleep. But as I pushed open my bedroom door, my entire world tilted on its axis. There, sitting in the middle of my bed, was a large kitchen knife. I froze in the doorway, unable to process what I was seeing. It wasn't one of my knives. This was bigger, and the blade gleamed wickedly in the dim light. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been in my bedroom. I backed out of the room, my heart thundering in my chest. I searched the rest of the house with trembling hands, but found no sign of an intruder. Nothing else seemed to be disturbed or missing. Just that knife, left there like a threat or a promise. I called the cops, of course. They came and took a report, dusted for prints, asked if I had any enemies. I told them about the man at the bar, but without a name or clear description, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested changing my locks and installing a security system. I didn't sleep at all that night. How could I, knowing someone had been in my home, in my bedroom? I kept replaying the man's words in my head. I know what you did. But what had I done? I racked my brain, trying to think of anyone I might have wronged so terribly. Nothing came to mind. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I had new locks installed and set up security cameras, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Every time I came home, I half expected to find that knife waiting for me again. I started seeing that man's face everywhere, in crowds, in passing cars, in the shadows outside my windows. Was he really there, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't be sure anymore. Work became almost impossible. Every time the door opened, I tensed up, expecting to see those hate-filled eyes again. My boss noticed my jumpiness and suggested I take some time off. But the thought of being alone in my house all day was even worse. A week after the incident, I was closing up the bar alone. As I walked to my car, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, keys clutched between my fingers as a makeshift weapon. But the parking lot was empty. I got in my car and locked the doors, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I swore I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching me drive away. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. The drive home was torture. Every set of headlights felt like it was following me. Every turn could be leading me into an ambush. By the time I got home, I was a nervous wreck. I checked and rechecked all the doors and windows before collapsing onto my couch, utterly exhausted. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to a loud crash from upstairs. My blood turned to ice. Someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but there was no signal. How was that possible? I always had service here. Another crash, closer this time. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes fell on a heavy glass ashtray on the coffee table. I snatched it up, holding it like a lifeline. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I pressed myself against the wall next to the living room doorway, heart pounding so loud I was sure the intruder could hear it. The ashtray was slick with sweat in my grip. A shadow fell across the threshold. I held my breath, muscles coiled to strike. But before I could move, a voice spoke from right behind me. "I told you your time was coming." I whirled around, swinging the ashtray wildly, but there was no one there. The living room was empty. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the locks. I had to get out, had to run. But when I finally got the door open and burst outside, I found myself right back in my living room. What the fuck was happening? I tried again and again, running out different doors and windows, but always ended up back inside. It was like my house had become some kind of twisted maze with no exit. And all the while, That voice kept whispering from just out of sight. I know what you did. You can't hide anymore. I don't know how long this went on. Hours, days. Time seemed to lose all meaning. I was trapped in an endless nightmare, hunted by an unseen presence in my own home. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I was ready to curl up in a ball and give up, I woke up. I was on my couch, drenched in sweat, early morning sunlight streaming through the windows. My phone was on the floor nearby, working perfectly fine. I searched the house, but found no sign of an intruder. No knife, no broken locks, nothing out of place. It had all been a dream. A vivid, horrifying dream, but a dream nonetheless. Or had it? It's been weeks now, and I still don't know what's real anymore. I haven't seen the man from the bar again. There have been no more knives, no more break-ins. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something is coming for me. I've thought about moving, about quitting my job and starting over somewhere new. But deep down, I know it wouldn't matter. Whatever this is, whoever is after me, they'd find me. So I wait, and I wonder, what did I do? Who have I wronged so terribly? And when will they finally make their move? I jump at every shadow, flinch at every unexpected sound. Sleep is a distant memory. I'm trapped in a waking nightmare, never knowing if today will be the day it all comes crashing down. If you're reading this, please, if you have any idea what might be happening to me, let me know. I'm desperate for answers, for any shred of explanation that might help me make sense of this hell I'm living in. And if you're the one who's after me, just end it already. This waiting, this constant fear, it's worse than anything you could do to me. I know what I did? Well, I don't, but I'm ready to face whatever consequences you think I deserve. Just please, let it be over. It was a typical Tuesday evening, slow and quiet. I was wiping down the bar when I noticed an elderly couple sitting in a corner booth. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as I continued to observe them between serving the few other patrons, something felt off. They weren't moving at all. No conversation, no sipping drinks, not even the slightest shift in posture. Just sitting ramrod straight, staring blankly at the wall. I figured maybe they were having some kind of dispute and giving each other the silent treatment. But as the minutes ticked by into nearly an hour, the stillness became eerie. I decided to approach their table, paste on my best customer service smile, and see if they needed anything. As I got closer, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was just something deeply unsettling about their vacant expressions. "Good evening, folks. Can I get you anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No response, not even a blink. I was about to speak again when the old man's head slowly swiveled to face me. The movement was unnaturally smooth, like an animatronic figure. His eyes locked onto mine and I felt my blood run cold. Those eyes, they were completely wrong, pitch black from corner to corner, no whites visible at all. And the look in them was predatory, hungry. My instincts screamed at me to run. I stammered out something about checking back later and practically fled back behind the bar, heart pounding. I busied myself with menial tasks, trying to calm down, but I could feel those eyes boring into me. When I finally worked up the courage to look back at their booth, they were gone. No sign they had ever been there at all. I hadn't seen or heard them leave, and I had a clear view of the exit. Thoroughly unnerved, I went to find my coworker Karen to ask if she'd noticed the creepy couple. She gave me a strange look. "What couple? That booth's been empty all night," she said. I insisted there had been an elderly man and woman sitting there less than 5 minutes ago. Karen just shook her head, looking concerned. Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should go home early. You look pale, she suggested. I knew what I had seen, but Karen's reaction made me start to doubt myself. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I having some kind of stress-induced hallucination? The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I kept glancing nervously at that booth, half expecting to see the couple materialize again, but it remained empty. As I was locking up around 2 a.m., movement outside caught my eye. 2 dark figures were standing motionless under a streetlight across the parking lot. Even from a distance, I recognized the elderly couple's distinctive silhouettes. My breath caught in my throat as the figures slowly turned in unison to face me. Those black, soulless eyes seemed to glow in the lamplight. A bone-deep chill washed over me. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I dove into my car and peeled out of the lot, not daring to look back. For days afterward, I was jumpy and on edge. I kept seeing glimpses of those figures out of the corner of my eye, in store windows, across the street, in my own backyard. But when I'd look directly, there would be nothing there. I haven't been back to work since that night. I can't bring myself to set foot in that place again. Karen's been calling, asking where I've been, but I don't know how to explain. I still don't understand what I experienced. Were they ghosts? Demons? Some kind of shared hallucination? All I know is that the memory of those inhuman eyes staring into mine still makes my skin crawl. I catch myself obsessively checking dark corners and empty chairs now, terrified of seeing that couple again. The rational part of my brain says it was just my imagination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever they were, they're not finished with me. Sometimes at night, I hear faint tapping at my bedroom window. When I work up the courage to look, there's never anything there. But I swear I can feel those black eyes watching me from the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what happened that night. Part of me doesn't want to know the truth. I just hope that by sharing my story, maybe someone out there has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of it all. For now, I'm left questioning my own sanity and jumping at every shadow. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. Those eyes haunt my dreams, and I can't shake the feeling that one day I'll turn around and see that couple standing behind me, waiting. I keep telling myself it's over, that whatever bizarre event I witnessed that night was a one-time thing. But deep down, I know better. This was just the beginning of something much bigger and more terrifying than I can comprehend. I've started researching local folklore and urban legends, desperate for some explanation. But nothing quite fits what I saw. The couple wasn't transparent or misty like typical ghost descriptions. They seemed solid and real, just fundamentally wrong in a way I can't fully articulate. I've debated going to a paranormal investigator or medium for help, but I'm scared of drawing more attention to myself. What if reaching out makes things worse? What if it attracts more of whatever they were? For now, I'm laying low. I rarely leave my apartment anymore, except for absolute necessities. I've covered all the mirrors and keep the curtains drawn. Nighttime is the worst. Every creak and shadow sends my heart racing. I know I can't live like this forever, but I don't know how to move forward. Those pitch-black eyes are seared into my memory. I keep reliving that moment when the old man turned to look at me, that predatory hunger in his gaze. What did they want from me? Why me? If anyone out there has experienced anything similar or has any insight into what I saw, please reach out. I'm desperate for answers, for some way to make sense of that night and move on with my life. but a part of me fears I'll never truly be free of whatever sinister force I encountered in that dim corner booth. All I can do now is stay vigilant and hope that someday I'll understand the truth behind those black-eyed beings.